The story followed Soo Ho Kim, a civil engineering student who suddenly woke up inside a novel he had read the previous night. But instead of becoming the hero, he found himself trapped in the body of Lloyd Frontera, a useless noble, infamous for drinking, laziness, and dragging his own family toward destruction. Yet Lloyd's terrible reputation was not the real problem. The true disaster was the future waiting for him. In the original story, the Frontera family drowned in debt, their land collapsed into ruin, and Lloyd himself died a pathetic death. Refusing to accept that fate, Soo Ho decided to change everything. Armed with the knowledge of the future and the mind of an engineer, he began rebuilding the doomed estate from the ground up, turning disasters into opportunities and chaos into profit. Beside him stood Javier Astrahan, a powerful knight who repeatedly found himself caught in Lloyd's absurd yet strangely effective schemes. A few years earlier, something unbelievable had happened to Soo Ho. A strange message suddenly rang through his head like a loud alarm, informing him that he had been chosen to receive a random wish granted by the Absolute. Before he could even understand what was happening, another message declared that he had now become a character inside Night of Blood and Iron, the novel he had read the night before. Deep within, Soo Ho struggled to process the absurd situation. The mention of a wish, the bizarre messages, and the sudden talk of possession made him wonder if he had truly crossed into another world like the protagonists of web novels. Then reality struck him in the most miserable way possible. He woke up face down on a dirt road. Shivering from the freezing cold, Soo Ho forced himself upright, only to realize something was terribly wrong with his jaw and lips. At that moment, another ridiculous alert cheerfully informed him that his jaw had gone out of place because he had slept on the ground. The infuriating message pushed him over the edge, and he slapped the floating window in irritation, already sick of the constant alerts. After painfully straightening his jaw, Soo Ho began organizing his thoughts. If he had truly possessed a character from Night of Blood and Iron, then there was only one person in the story miserable enough to sleep alone on the ground in the middle of nowhere: Lloyd Frontera. Before he could think further, a voice called out to him, announcing that Master Lloyd had finally been found after an exhausting search. Soo Ho turned toward the source of the voice and froze. A handsome young man with silver hair stood before him. He looked no older than 20, and his expression carried not even the slightest trace of warmth or laughter. It was Javier Astrahan, the protagonist of Night of Blood and Iron. Inside, Soo Ho stared at the silver-haired young man in disbelief. Javier looked exactly as he had been described in the novel. The realization struck even harder when he remembered who Javier was supposed to serve. Javier Astrahan was the renowned swordsman who would later shake the world, though at this point he was merely an unknown knight working under the Lord of the territory, Arcos Frontera. And the eldest son of Baron Frontera was none other than Lloyd Frontera. The horrifying truth hit Soo Ho all at once, leaving his face completely disoriented as he blurted out that he had become the hooligan Lloyd Frontera. Javier calmly pointed out that he had called him by name, not a hooligan. Then, with a faint smirk forming on his usually emotionless face, Javier remarked that it was at least fortunate that Lloyd possessed some self-awareness. At the same moment, a cheerful system message appeared, announcing that Javier seemed to be in a good mood. Already irritated beyond measure, Soo Ho snapped at the system internally and demanded that it shut up. A short while later, they arrived at the Frontera mansion. As Javier lit the fireplace, he explained exactly what had happened earlier that day. Lloyd had apparently started drinking in the afternoon, gotten completely drunk, destroyed the furniture inside a pub, and eventually collapsed on the road while trying to return to the manor. Deep down, Soo Ho could only admit that it truly sounded like the daily routine of a hopeless hooligan. Javier continued speaking in his usual calm tone, explaining that the Lord had grown worried and sent him to search for Lloyd. Though Lloyd was indeed a hooligan, he was still the Baron's son, and dying on the roadside with a dislocated jaw would naturally sadden his father. Privately, Soo Ho shivered at the way Javier casually slipped insults into otherwise sincere statements. The freezing cold only made things worse. For a brief moment, he longed for the comfort of a heated ondol floor, but reality immediately crushed that thought. This was a medieval fantasy world, not Korea. After finishing his report, Javier stated that he would allow Lloyd to rest and planned to inform the Baron about everything the following day. Soo Ho immediately tried to stop him, but Javier answered with a firm refusal. Before Javier could leave, Soo Ho hesitated and asked about the Frontera family's debt. Javier reacted with visible annoyance, finding the question strangely out of character. Without another word, he closed the door and left the room. Once alone, Soo Ho lowered his head in despair. He knew everything that would happen in this story. Just the previous night, inside his tiny boarding house room in Korea, he had finished reading the final chapter of Night of Blood and Iron. And because of that, he knew exactly how Lloyd Frontera's life ended. First, the Baron and Baroness would fall victim to a wicked conman, losing all their land and wealth before ultimately taking their own lives. After that, Lloyd himself would become a miserable beggar who spent his days drowning in alcohol until he eventually coughed up blood and died. Frustration exploded out of him as he jumped to his feet. Becoming an aristocrat had apparently changed nothing. The misery felt exactly the same as the life he had lived in Korea. The overwhelming sense of deja vu only deepened his anger. Then another familiar message window suddenly appeared before him, once again announcing that he had been chosen to receive a random wish granted by the Absolute. Furious, Soo Ho cursed the so-called Absolute in his mind, unable to understand what kind of twisted wish could possibly place him inside the body of someone doomed to such a pathetic ending. The very next morning, shortly after sunrise, Lloyd received visitors in his chamber. Standing before him were Lloyd's mother, Marbella Frontera, and Javier Azrahan. Marbella carefully brought up the incident from the previous night, mentioning that he had apparently broken furniture at the pub once again. Inside, Lloyd could only grumble that while the real Lloyd had been causing chaos at taverns, he himself had merely been peacefully reading a book the night before in Korea. With visible concern, Marbella pleaded with him to at least visit the pub and apologize this time. Scratching his head awkwardly, Lloyd reluctantly accepted responsibility. Even if the mess had been created by the original owner of this body, he still had to clean it up now. So after a brief hesitation, he agreed to apologize. The response instantly shocked both Marbella and Javier. At the same moment, a system message appeared, announcing that the two people before him were highly confused by his behavior. Lloyd simply bit his lower lip with a quiet huff. As he stepped outside the manor and made his way toward the village, his strides gradually grew longer. Along the road, the reactions of the townspeople made his terrible reputation painfully clear. The moment villagers noticed him, they quickly moved aside and lowered their heads to avoid eye contact. Some looked outright terrified, and even children burst into tears the instant their eyes met his. Windows slammed shut one after another. Then another system message popped up, bluntly informing him that the villagers absolutely detested him. Within moments, Lloyd fully accepted the reality of the situation. This was exactly the kind of man Lloyd Frontera had been. While walking, Lloyd suddenly asked Javier why he was following him. Javier calmly explained that the Baron had ordered him to escort Lloyd to ensure yesterday's incident would not repeat itself. For a moment, Lloyd almost sounded touched by the idea of receiving an escort, but Javier immediately crushed that misunderstanding by clarifying that the escort was not for Lloyd's protection. It was for the villagers. Javier was protecting them from him. Lloyd dryly compared himself to a gangster. Deep within, however, his thoughts had already shifted toward survival. The first thing he needed to do was erase this scumbag reputation. At the very least, that might earn him food in the future if he truly ended up as a beggar. But if he could somehow solve the Frontera family's debt before disaster struck, then perhaps he could avoid that tragic fate entirely and peacefully live out his life as the heir of a rural barony, enjoying comfort and luxury until old age. As he examined the system window, Lloyd searched hopefully for some kind of cheat ability or overpowered skill. To his surprise, he actually did possess skills. Unfortunately, the skills were complete nonsense. One passive skill, Human Scum, caused other people to instinctively furrow their brows whenever they saw him. Another skill, Rowdy Drunkard, turned him into an unbearable menace whenever activated. The sheer absurdity of the descriptions instantly irritated him, and he wildly swung his arms around in frustration while trying to dismiss the floating messages. Beside him, Javier watched the strange behavior with growing confusion. Eventually, Javier asked where Lloyd thought he was going. Completely distracted, Lloyd blankly questioned what he meant. Javier pointed out that the pub was in the opposite direction, and bluntly wondered if Lloyd had lied earlier about apologizing. Startled, Lloyd hurriedly denied it and awkwardly explained that he had simply been lost in thought. Javier silently stared at him as confusion slowly spread across his face. Growing uncomfortable under the gaze, Lloyd nervously kept asking what was wrong. After a brief silence, Javier merely shook his head and stated that it was nothing before telling Lloyd to continue inside. Lloyd carefully creaked the pub door open and awkwardly greeted the people inside. Behind him, Javier silently observed the scene. Since the previous night, something about Lloyd had felt strangely different. It was almost as if he had become an entirely different person. Inside, the pub was in complete complete disarray. Broken tables and chairs lay scattered across the room, while shattered dishes littered the floor. Facing the pub owner directly, Lloyd offered a sincere apology for everything that had happened the night before. The owner froze in shock. His face instantly turned pale with fear, almost as though he had just seen a ghost. Rather than accepting the apology, he instinctively took a defensive stance and nervously begged Lloyd not to do this. Inside, Lloyd quickly realized the problem. The owner seemed even more terrified because the infamous Lloyd Frontera was suddenly acting polite. Thinking that being slightly rougher might feel more natural, Lloyd awkwardly switched his tone and gave a far less sincere apology with an exaggerated swagger. Immediately, the system bluntly informed him that his apology did not sound genuine at all. Privately, Lloyd nearly exploded in frustration, wondering what exactly he was supposed to do. Meanwhile, the owner continued sweating profusely and hurriedly insisted that no apology was necessary. Faced with such a hesitant and fearful reaction, Lloyd found himself completely unable to respond. A short while later, he and Javier stepped back outside the pub. Lloyd quietly admitted that even after apologizing, the owner had not looked happy in the slightest. Javier explained that such a reaction was only natural. Everything Lloyd had destroyed the previous night, from the furniture to the decorations, had been purchased through the pub owner's hard-earned money. Simply apologizing would never satisfy someone who had suffered financial damage without compensation. Deep down, Lloyd groaned at the reality of the situation. Their family was already drowning in debt, yet fixing his reputation apparently required money as well. It felt absurdly difficult to earn even the smallest amount of goodwill from the villagers. Still, the conclusion became painfully obvious to him. Unless the Frontera family repaid its debts, nothing would ever truly change. But the real question was how. Javier continued explaining that the pub owner's mother had also fallen sick due to the harsh late winter cold. Combined with Lloyd's destructive behavior, the situation had likely become even harder for the man to endure. That detail immediately caught Lloyd's attention. Inside, he recalled how cold the interior of the pub had felt. A simple fireplace was nowhere near enough to properly heat an entire building, and elderly people especially could not withstand such freezing temperatures for long, unless they had ondel floors. The moment that thought crossed his mind, everything suddenly connected. A spark of realization exploded inside his head, like a blazing light bulb. His eyes widened as ideas rapidly formed one after another, almost like structural blueprints assembling themselves in his mind. Deep within, Lloyd felt overwhelming excitement surge through him. There were no ondel floors in this world. If he introduced them here, they would absolutely sell. The original Lloyd Frontera could never have imagined something like this, but Soo Ho Kim could. He had majored in civil engineering back in Korea. During his military service as an engineer, he had personally constructed an entire house by himself. He had spent countless days and nights working at construction sites. This was it. With this idea, he could pay off all of the Frontera family's debts. Suddenly filled with excitement, Lloyd lengthened his strides and urgently told Javier that they needed to return to the pub immediately. Confused by the sudden change in direction, Javier questioned the reason behind it. Lloyd responded with visible enthusiasm, declaring that he was about to secure his very first order. The moment those words left his mouth, countless notification windows flooded his vision. The system announced that his true journey had finally begun, and that the RP system had now been activated. According to the explanation, relationship points could be earned by improving relationships with key characters. Inside, Lloyd frowned in confusion. The term RP sounded suspiciously similar to experience points, yet the system explained absolutely nothing about how they were supposed to be used. Still, one particular phrase immediately caught his attention: key characters. As Lloyd slowly turned his head toward Javier, he suddenly noticed a floating message window above him displaying Javier's approval rating, -30. The number stunned him. Deep down, Lloyd immediately concluded that such a score had to be catastrophically low. Trying to improve things right away, Lloyd suddenly flashed a grin at Javier and awkwardly complimented his appearance, sincerely insisting that he was extremely handsome. Instantly, the system informed him that Javier's approval rating had decreased by another point. Javier calmly responded with a perfectly straight face, stating that he was already aware of his own appearance. Lloyd's face twitched in disbelief. Inside, he nearly screamed in frustration over why the approval rating had somehow gone down instead of up. Realizing that forcing things would only make the situation worse, he decided to abandon the idea for the moment. Not long afterward, the two returned to the pub. pub. This time, Lloyd confidently explained his plan to the pub owner. Holding out a contract, he proposed a deal in which the pub owner would act as the purchaser while he himself would handle the construction work. In exchange, all construction fees would be counted against the damages Lloyd had caused earlier. Then, with complete confidence, he pushed the contract forward and urged the owner to sign it. The pub owner, however, remained completely silent. At the same time, another system notification appeared, bluntly informing Lloyd that the pub owner was looking at him suspiciously. Deep within, Lloyd clicked his tongue in frustration. The biggest problem was that absolutely nobody trusted Lloyd Frontera. If things continued like this, his grand plan would collapse before it even began. Reluctantly, he decided to make use of Lloyd's terrible reputation instead. His entire demeanor suddenly changed as he frowned and spoke in a far more intimidating tone, insisting that they would be seeing each other often from now on, and that the pub owner should simply trust him. Terrified, the pub owner immediately signed the contract without another word. Although the tactic worked perfectly, the system instantly labeled Lloyd as garbage. Frustrated, Lloyd quietly muttered to himself, wondering what else he had realistically been supposed to do. Nearby, Javier continued watching him in visible confusion, while Lloyd happily celebrated securing the agreement. Grinning with satisfaction, he assured the pub owner that he had made the right decision and promised not to disappoint him. At last, Lloyd had obtained what he wanted. Within that unfamiliar world, he had secured his very first order. It was small, but it marked the first step towards something much larger. And so, his long-awaited construction project finally began. Outside, Lloyd stood holding a shovel while carefully observing the area. Since the room only needed to feel warm and cozy, he concluded that the measurements did not need to be perfectly precise. At that moment, Javier questioned him directly, pointing out that he had practically threatened the pub owner into signing the contract and asking whether this was simply another one of Lloyd's schemes to cause trouble. Lloyd slowly turned toward him with narrowed eyes. Then, surprisingly, he began talking about cognitive distortion. Confused, Javier repeated the unfamiliar term. Lloyd explained that it referred to the tendency to assume someone would always behave according to their past actions. According to him, prejudice and negative thinking distorted people's judgment. Javier immediately argued that it was not prejudice at all, but rather conclusions based on experience and statistics. Without hesitation, Lloyd countered by pointing out that experience and statistics themselves were also entirely based on the past. For once, Javier found himself unable to respond. Inside, confusion spread through him as he wondered when Lloyd had become this smooth-talking. Then Lloyd confidently declared that he would make the pub owner and his sick mother smile. The moment those words left his mouth, he immediately began digging. Yet privately, Lloyd grinned with delight for an entirely different reason. Those smiles would become the very foundation of his future profits. Day after day, Lloyd tirelessly scooped dirt, moved it, packed it down, and repeated the process over and over again. Slowly, his idea began taking shape. The timber came directly from the warehouse of the Frontera estate, and Lloyd carefully constructed the framework in a traditional timber style. Eventually, exhaustion completely overtook him. Collapsing flat onto the ground, Lloyd gasped heavily for breath. Inside, he cursed the weakness of his current body. Nearby, Javier dryly remarked that Lloyd had collapsed after merely 3 swings. Lloyd instantly shot upright in outrage and protested that he had been working for an entire week. Silently observing the scene, Javier found himself increasingly confused. Lloyd truly was building something seriously. He even appeared fully intent on honoring the contract with the pub owner. And yet Javier still struggled to believe it. Could the infamous hooligan Lloyd Frontera really have changed this much? Lloyd painfully forced himself back to his feet, groaning from the soreness spreading through his entire body. Every muscle ached, yet he refused to rest. As he reached for the axe, his exhausted hands trembled violently. Before he could even swing it toward the timber, Javier suddenly grabbed the axe from him and calmly asked what needed to be done. Caught off guard, Lloyd quickly explained that he needed thin wooden pieces cut to specific measurements, each roughly 2 hands in length, 1 hand wide, and 1 finger thick. Without another word, Javier extended his arm and began chopping. The sight was unbelievable. His movements were so fast and precise that every single piece of timber was cut exactly according to Lloyd's instructions. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, and no error. Lloyd's jaw practically dropped in admiration. Deep within, he could only marvel at the fact that Javier truly was someone destined to become a master swordsman. Compared to this level of skill, modern equipment suddenly felt unnecessary. Unable to hide his amazement, Lloyd gave him a thumbs up before solemnly placing a hand on Javier's shoulder and casually asking him to help with the digging once the cutting was finished. Javier froze in disbelief. Inside, shock and regret immediately surged through him. Rather than thanking him for the help, Lloyd had somehow turned the situation into even more labor. At that moment, Javier became fully convinced that Lloyd Frontera was hopeless. The system instantly notified Lloyd that Javier regretted his decision. Completely unfazed, Lloyd explained that Javier was only helping because he was curious. Deep down, Javier clearly believed Lloyd was attempting to scam the pub owner somehow, and he desperately wanted to see how the trick would unfold. Lloyd pointed out the obvious conclusion. If Javier truly wanted answers, then the work needed to be completed faster, and the fastest way to accomplish that was by working together. Hearing that, Javier slowly realized he had been cornered by logic. Internally, he admitted that Lloyd truly had changed drastically over the past few days. Yet despite that change, Lloyd's terrible past still made him impossible to trust completely. In the end, Javier decided the only thing he could do was help finish the construction quickly and witness Lloyd's true intentions for himself. And so, the two of them worked side by side. Together, they endlessly scooped mud, carried materials, and continued construction at full speed. Days passed before their efforts finally produced the desired result. At long last, the construction was complete. Overwhelmed with exhaustion and triumph, Lloyd loudly celebrated the completion of his project. Carved onto the finished building were several letters, which immediately caught Javier's attention. Lloyd casually explained that it was his brand's logo. Confused, Javier questioned what a logo even was. Lloyd merely brushed the question aside before turning toward Javier with a grin and suggesting that they finally discover what kind of scheme he had supposedly prepared for the pub owner. Javier remained silent. Despite everything, distrust still lingered inside him. A short while later, Lloyd chopped additional wood and lit the fire. Gradually, steam began rising as heat spread beneath the carefully constructed floorboards of the building. The reaction was immediate. The pub owner and his elderly mother could hardly believe what they were experiencing. Overcome with excitement, they rolled across the warm floor in amazement. The old woman happily exclaimed that it felt wonderful and soothing, and that even her stiff joints suddenly felt relaxed again. Meanwhile, the pub owner stared around in pure disbelief, unable to comprehend how such a thing was even possible. Inside, Lloyd grinned proudly. To the people of this world, the Ondel floor system must have seemed almost magical, yet to him, this was simply the power of Korean floor heating. Then, with genuine gratitude overflowing from his voice, the pub owner sincerely thanked Lloyd and admitted that it had been a very long time since he had last seen his mother smile like that. Javier silently watched the pub owner and his mother smiling with genuine happiness. The sight completely stunned him. Inside, countless thoughts raced through his mind. Lloyd's sudden change in speech and manners had already been strange enough, yet now he was working tirelessly and even honoring promises made to the people of the territory. Javier struggled to understand it. The Lloyd Frontera he knew would never do something purely to make others happy. And yet the impossible was unfolding right before his eyes. Those two people were genuinely smiling because of Lloyd. At that exact moment, another system message appeared before Lloyd, informing him that Javier's approval rating had increased by 2 points. In addition, he received 36 RP for slightly improving his relationship with a key character. Immediately noticing Javier's expression, Lloyd smugly declared that Javier was probably thinking he was not complete garbage after all. Javier instantly denied it. Lloyd insisted that he definitely was thinking exactly that. Javier denied it once more without hesitation. Privately, Lloyd simply grinned in satisfaction. Regardless of Javier's stubbornness, progress had finally been made. Financially, the project had been a complete loss due to the timber costs alone, but that no longer mattered, because the house itself was never the real goal. It was merely a model house meant to attract customers, and the strategy worked perfectly. The rumor spread through the village with incredible speed. As always, where people existed, rumors traveled even faster. Soon, villagers began lining up outside the model house just to experience the warm steam-heated floor themselves. Many stepped inside with skepticism, only to leave completely astonished, amazed by the overwhelming warmth. Meanwhile, Lloyd confidently sat beside his freshly prepared construction designs and enthusiastically advertised his services. He proudly showed off different housing styles, explaining which designs were annexes and which were full home remodels. To push sales even further, he even offered discounts for customers who who ordered multiple constructions together. Unfortunately, another system message quickly informed him that the villagers still did not trust him at all. The villagers awkwardly hesitated instead of responding positively. The moment Lloyd sensed their doubt, he immediately switched back to his rough hooligan demeanor. Pressuring them with exaggerated familiarity, he insisted that they would be seeing each other often from now on and dramatically complained about how unfair it was for them not to trust him, especially when he was practically giving the service away at such cheap prices. Right then, another voice suddenly interrupted him. The moment Lloyd turned around, he found himself facing Lloyd Frontera, the lord of the territory, and his father. The Baron sternly demanded to know exactly what Lloyd thought he was doing. At once, the noisy crowd fell completely silent. An awkward atmosphere spread across the area as Lloyd quietly followed his father back toward the Baron's mansion. Later, the two sat across from one another during a tense meal filled with silence. While glancing at Arcos, Lloyd carefully observed him. Until now, he had managed to avoid interacting directly with his father, but a new worry now surfaced inside him. What if Arcos stopped him from continuing the construction business? Finally, the Baron broke the silence and demanded an explanation for whatever Lloyd was plotting this time. Inside, Lloyd immediately decided to keep the conversation short and answer in the rough, rude manner expected of the original Lloyd. So with deliberate bluntness, he simply explained that the pub owner had ordered an Ondol room and he had built it for him. Arcos calmly questioned whether other villagers were placing construction orders as well. Lloyd casually responded that his father already seemed fully aware of the situation. The Baron's expression remained stern as he reminded Lloyd that the people of the territory were under the Frontera family's protection. He made it absolutely clear that he would never tolerate Lloyd deceiving or exploiting them. Lloyd answered without much concern, insisting that he had never planned to trick anyone in the first place. Still, inside, he clearly understood the situation. No matter what he did, everyone instinctively expected the worst from Lloyd Frontera. Realizing the atmosphere would only become more uncomfortable the longer he stayed, Lloyd quickly stood up and announced that he would take his leave if the conversation was over. Just as he began walking away, Arcos spoke again. His father quietly asked whether all of this was connected to the Frontera family's financial situation. Lloyd was not blind or deaf, so naturally he knew the territory was struggling. Even so, Arcos assured him not to worry because he would somehow resolve everything himself soon. Then he told Lloyd not to involve himself too deeply in these matters. The words instantly stopped Lloyd in his tracks. Slowly looking back, he realized he had heard almost the exact same thing once before. Back in his original life, his real father had spoken those very words to him. At that time, his father had reassured him that everything would be fine and told him to simply focus on studying hard without worrying about the family's financial problems. Deep down, Lloyd bitterly recalled how he had genuinely believed those comforting words back then. But everything had fallen apart anyway. His father's reassurance had been a lie. This time, Lloyd refused to suffer another miserable life because of money. So while leaving the room, he quietly told Arcos not to give up because he himself had no intention of giving up either. Inside, regret lingered heavily within him. A few years ago, he wished he had said those same words to his real father. As Lloyd continued walking through the hallway, his thoughts shifted back toward business. They already had 32 orders for Style A houses and 57 for Style B remodels, and half of the construction fees had already been collected in advance. Then, midway through the hall, two men walked past him. They were the moneylenders, Meatloaf and Shyloff. The pair ignored him completely and continued on their way without even offering a greeting. Immediately, Lloyd found the behavior suspicious. He was still the son of the territory's lord, yet those men had shown him absolutely no respect. Then realization suddenly struck him. At that exact moment, the system notified him that his current relationship points totaled 36. Lloyd immediately remembered that he had earned those points after slightly increasing Javier's approval rating. The real question now was how those points were actually supposed to be used. For once, the system gave him a direct answer. RP could apparently be invested into gaining abilities. Genuinely impressed, Lloyd sarcastically praised the system for finally explaining something properly. The system instantly reacted in irritation and bluntly told him to forget it. Realizing he had annoyed it again, Lloyd hurriedly apologized and promised to stop mocking it. A loud buzzing sound followed. Suddenly, a blue light spread beneath Lloyd's feet as countless abilities appeared before him. Skills related to civil engineering rapidly filled his vision, including soil mechanics, hydraulics, structural mechanics, water supply butterfly and sewage theory, steel structure design, concrete design, and advanced design programming. The system sounded genuinely surprised, remarking that Lloyd apparently knew far more than he looked like he should. Lloyd immediately shot back in annoyance, reminding the system that he had earned a scholarship back in Korea. Moments later, the system informed him that based on his existing knowledge, 2 abilities were currently available for acquisition: basic surveying and basic design. Privately, Lloyd admitted he had no idea how those abilities were being determined from his existing knowledge, but since he had enough RP available, he decided to simply purchase them and see what happened. The instant he spent 35 points on the 2 abilities, a brilliant beam of light exploded across his vision. Lloyd screamed in complete shock as the sensation overwhelmed him. In a panic, he rushed toward the window and threw it open. But the moment he looked outside, he froze in absolute disbelief. With nothing but his bare eyes, he could now instantly survey everything within a 10-meter radius. Even more astonishingly, he could accurately perceive the properties of the surrounding soil and nearby bodies of water as though detailed engineering data had been directly embedded into his vision. At the same time, part of his vision transformed into something resembling augmented reality. Countless structures, measurements, and layouts unfolded before his eyes like an advanced 3-dimensional hologram version of a CAD design program. The sight completely stunned him. Inside, Lloyd excitedly recalled how he previously had to work himself to exhaustion while manually drawing plans for water channels and structures. With abilities like this, construction work would become infinitely easier from now on. But another problem quickly surfaced in his mind. Would Javier alone really be enough manpower to handle all future construction projects? Deep down, Lloyd began wishing he could somehow summon heavy machinery using his engineering knowledge. To his complete shock, the system suddenly informed him that something similar actually existed. Lloyd immediately reacted in excitement and demanded to know if it was real. The system then launched into an overly dramatic explanation, advertising summon partners with unique personalities and a wide range of skills, almost like a cheap premium game advertisement. Lloyd instantly became suspicious. The system calmly informed him that one summon required 50 RP. Inside, Lloyd immediately understood the potential value of such a summon. If it truly worked the way he imagined, then it could become just as useful as heavy construction equipment. The conclusion became obvious. He desperately needed more RP, and the only way to obtain it was by getting key characters to like him. While Lloyd remained lost in thought, the 2 moneylenders marched directly into the Baron's chamber. Without any respect whatsoever, Shylock casually sat on the Baron's table and aggressively demanded to know how much longer Arcos intended to delay repayment. Beside him, Meatloaf reminded the Baron that 5 entire days had already passed since their agreed deadline. If repayment continued to stall, they warned that they would have no choice but to take action. Shylock then mockingly suggested that the Frontera family should simply sell off some possessions if they needed money so badly. Outside the chamber, Lloyd quietly peeked through the door while listening to the entire conversation. A sly grin slowly spread across his face. Inside, he realized the timing could not have been more perfect. Then Meatloaf slammed his hand heavily onto the table before offering a cruel suggestion. If the Frontera family truly had no money left, perhaps the Baroness and her ladies could be sold off somewhere profitable instead. The horrifying proposal instantly shocked Arcos. Before the atmosphere could grow even uglier, Lloyd suddenly stepped into the room and casually leaned against Meatloaf while remarking that being a lender did not excuse such terrible manners. Meatloaf immediately shoved him away and angrily demanded to know who he thought he was. Arcos looked equally stunned by Lloyd's sudden appearance. Recognizing him, Meatloaf mockingly referred to Lloyd as the eldest son known for his strange behavior and rudely demanded that he stop interrupting their discussion. Lloyd completely ignored the threat. Instead, he casually demanded to see their warrant. The sudden request instantly caught both moneylenders off guard. Without hesitation, Lloyd confidently began reciting legal terminology, citing the Royal Family and Nobility Act, Article 3, Clause 6. According to the law, nobles possess the right to protect their interests as vassals of the king, and entering the residence of a noble family without a warrant constituted trespassing. The moneylenders stared at him in complete shock. Neither of them had ever even heard of such a law. Lloyd casually shrugged and suggested that if they were so uncertain, then they could simply go verify it together. In truth, almost nobody actually followed that law. Even so, the law undeniably existed. The moment Lloyd saw the moneylenders barging into the Baron's chamber, he immediately recalled a memorable scene from the Night of Blood and Iron. It took place shortly after the Frontera couple's suicide. During their funeral, the same 2 loan sharks had appeared at the mansion and shamelessly caused a disturbance, even demanding the corpses of the Baron and Baroness so they could sell them for money. That was the moment Javier had drawn his sword. Invoking the exact same law, Javier had cut both men down in a single strike. Although he was later brought before a judge, he ultimately escaped punishment because the law was legitimate and the loan sharks had unlawfully entered the residence and created chaos. Remembering that scene perfectly, Lloyd immediately called for Javier. Javier stepped forward at once and respectfully answered the summons. Then, wearing a cruel grin, Lloyd calmly ordered Javier to cut off the arm of the trespasser. The atmosphere froze instantly. Javier slowly began walking toward the moneylenders while unsheathing his sword. The two men immediately panicked. Terrified, they stumbled backward while shouting that they would sue over this madness. Lloyd merely smiled. As calmly as ever, he suggested that they find out together whose side the judge would actually support. Of course, Lloyd knew they could not truly kill the men under the current circumstances since they had not crossed the same line as in the novel, but this was the perfect excuse to throw them out of the mansion. Furious and humiliated, the two loan sharks snarled threats as they retreated. Lloyd simply laughed mockingly while watching them leave in trembling rage. Only after they were gone did Arcos finally speak again. The Baron's voice carried shock and urgency as he demanded to know what Lloyd had just done. The Frontera family barely possessed enough money to keep the lenders at bay, and provoking them further seemed insane. Without saying much, Lloyd quietly pulled out a pouch from inside his clothes and placed it on the desk. He explained that he had originally planned to hand over the money only after collecting the remaining payments from the construction orders, but even this amount should still be enough to cover a significant portion of that month's interest. Arcos froze. The moment he realized the money came from construction orders placed by the villagers, he immediately misunderstood the situation and accused Lloyd of extorting the territory's people. Before the misunderstanding could escalate further, Javier suddenly stepped in and calmly reassured the Baron. He promised that he would personally ensure Lloyd fulfilled every single order properly. Watching the exchange, Lloyd quietly noticed something important. His father completely trusted Javier. Realizing there was no point staying any longer, Lloyd lowered his head respectfully toward the Baron before quickly leaving the office before Arcos could stop him. Later, while the two walked outside together, Javier questioned Lloyd about the law he had cited earlier. He admitted that he had always assumed Lloyd was the ignorant type, making the sudden legal knowledge feel completely out of place. Lloyd casually brushed the question aside and claimed he had simply picked it up somewhere before impatiently asking whether that answer was good enough. Inside, however, Lloyd remained completely relaxed. Knowing the contents of the novel gave him an enormous advantage, and more importantly, he was already waiting for the system notification he knew was about to appear. Right on cue, the pop-up window finally appeared before him. The system announced that Arcos Frontera's likability toward him had increased by 6 points. Although the current relationship score with Arcos still remained at -14, Lloyd still earned 60 RP for improving his relationship with a main character. His total RP now stood at 61. The moment he saw the number, Lloyd grinned with pure delight. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. At long last, he was finally getting closer to obtaining his summon. With firm determination, Lloyd scanned his surroundings once again. Fortunately, the moonlit training hall remained completely empty, with no trace of another person's presence. Taking a deep breath, he opened the system window. His eyes quickly locked onto a single section hidden among the overwhelming flood of information before him. Without hesitation, he selected yes and gave a confident nod. The announcement declaring the start of the random summon game appeared before him as 50 RP vanished instantly. At that exact moment, something began to emerge 5 steps ahead. A pale light engraved itself across the ground, forming a complicated figure. The magic circle radiated a strange and mystical energy. Anticipation filled Lloyd as he stared at the glowing circle, waiting to see what would appear from it. Then, at last, something shot out from the center and flew directly toward him. Soft and fluffy fur, a plump little bottom, tiny arms and legs. A body so small it was less than half the size of his fist. It was a hamster. The tiny creature immediately cried out with an energetic squeak, but Lloyd could only stare at it in disbelief as confusion spread across his face. He questioned why a hamster had appeared from the summon circle in the first place. Deep down, disbelief quickly turned into disappointment. This was supposed to be his summon partner. He had spent an entire 50 RP on the game, only for the result to be a tiny hamster. The crushing sense of waste settled within him as he dismissed it as a complete dud. The hamster instantly choked in shock after being disregarded so harshly. It hurriedly squeaked toward Lloyd, desperately trying to defend itself. Lloyd remained utterly unconvinced. Privately, he mocked the creature's usefulness, wondering if its grand ability was throwing acorns. As far as he was concerned, he had absolutely no need for something like that. Panicking, the hamster frantically waved its tiny arms around, desperately attempting to explain itself. Then it suddenly stuffed both hands into its mouth and began pulling something out from inside its cheek. A small envelope emerged first, followed by a wrinkled piece of paper no larger than a business card. With visible disgust, Lloyd picked them up while saliva dripped from the soaked paper. The message explained that Podong was an adorable hamster deserving plenty of love. It further stated that feeding Podong one of the enclosed sunflower seeds would alter its size. The red sunflower seeds would cause Podong to grow to gigantic proportions, with the effect lasting for a maximum of 12 hours. The blue sunflower seeds would shrink Podong back to its original small size, and it specifically warned that the blue seed had to be fed before the 12-hour limit expired. Lloyd carefully read the contents of the paper again. One set of the two-colored sunflower seeds cost 1 RP. Inside, curiosity immediately surfaced as he wondered just how large Podong could actually become. The hamster instantly jumped in response, as if proudly answering the question itself. Lloyd fed one of the sunflower seeds to Podong while thoughtfully considering the possibilities. Deep within, he recalled how excellent hamsters were at digging tunnels, and if Podong could truly grow as large as a human, the creature might become incredibly useful. He cautiously stepped backward. Excitement and concern mixed together as he closely observed the tiny hamster, waiting to see the result. The hamster instantly expanded to nearly 10 meters in size, the sudden growth throwing Lloyd completely off balance. Lloyd stared upward in utter disbelief as Podong's massive face towered high above him. The once tiny hamster had transformed into an enormous giant. Still, amazement alone was not enough. Lloyd immediately decided to test Podong's abilities. He called out to see whether the giant hamster could still hear him. Podong lowered his gigantic head toward him with a curious expression. Lloyd then asked if he could dig a perfectly uniform furrow 2 meters deep, stretching from one point to another. After tilting his head in confusion for a brief moment, Podong suddenly understood and enthusiastically nodded. The giant hamster waddled toward the designated location, his enormous chubby backside swaying heavily with every step. Then he began digging. His tiny front paws moved at terrifying speed. A violent storm of soil erupted into the air as massive piles of dirt exploded upward in every direction. Podong's giant round body bulldozed forward mercilessly while carving through the earth with overwhelming efficiency. Watching the spectacle, Lloyd clenched his fist in pure delight. Inside, excitement exploded through him as he realized he had hit the jackpot. He practically saw Podong as his very own piece of heavy construction equipment. As Lloyd later walked back toward his chamber, another thought surfaced within him. If anyone suddenly saw him controlling a gigantic hamster, suspicion would naturally follow. Fortunately, he quickly came up with what he considered the perfect solution. Confidentially pleased with himself, Lloyd decided he would simply carry a book about summoning everywhere he went. If anyone questioned him, he would casually claim to be a summoning master. A smug grin spread across his face as he admired his own brilliance. Deep down, he genuinely wondered how he could possibly be this smart. As the night passed, Lloyd's next plan became clear. He intended to transform Baron Frontera's ordinary knights and guards into a full-scale construction workforce. The following morning arrived beneath bright sunlight and perfect weather for construction work. Standing near the river, Lloyd faced the 30 gathered men and loudly instructed them to repeat after him, declaring that safety came first. The soldiers responded with exhausted yawns and lifeless voices, barely managing to repeat the words with any enthusiasm at all. Watching their pathetic reaction, frustration built within Lloyd. To him, they looked exactly like soldiers being paid to sit around doing absolutely nothing. Privately, he could not understand why Baron Frontera continued keeping them around despite drowning in debt. Still, that irritation quickly turned into satisfaction. Regardless of the reason, those idle soldiers were now free labor, and Lloyd fully intended to put every last one of them to work. Grabbing a shovel, Lloyd firmly addressed the gathered soldiers. He reminded them that they were soldiers, and this place was an army. In his eyes, the purpose of an army was simple: to work. Pointing toward the enormous pile of clay nearby, Lloyd declared that the entire mound had been dug up during the previous night. Though in reality, Podong had finished the task in barely 30 minutes. Still, Lloyd conveniently ignored that detail. He then proudly announced that they were about to begin the estate's renaissance through the Ondol construction business meant for the people. To make that happen, every single soldier would be responsible for transporting the clay to the construction site. The soldiers' expressions immediately collapsed after seeing the overwhelming amount of labor waiting for them. Lloyd calmly observed their miserable reactions. Inside, he had already expected this much resistance. And besides, his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a grim voice. Senior Knight Neumann had arrived. As the highest-ranking knight in Baron Frontera's territory, Neumann immediately demanded to know why his men were being ordered around like laborers. Lloyd quietly watched him with a calculating gaze. Deep within, he had fully expected this confrontation as well. There were only 3 knights within the barony. Neumann stood at the top, beneath him was Bayern, and finally there was Javier Azrahan, the true protagonist of the novel. At the beginning of the original story, when the estate eventually collapsed into ruin, Javier and Bayern remained loyal to the Baron until the very end. But Neumann was different. He was the very first to betray Baron Frontera and flee. Secretly, Neumann sold information about the Baron to swindlers, worsening the estate's already catastrophic debts before abandoning everything behind. To Lloyd, allowing a man like that to remain the land's leading knight was completely unacceptable. Keeping his composure, Lloyd casually asked Neumann what exactly it looked like he was doing. Neumann coldly accused him of forcing honorable soldiers to roll around in dirt. As their commander, he refused to tolerate such treatment. Inside, Lloyd dismissed the argument as complete nonsense. Deep down, he knew the real reason behind Neumann's hostility. The knight was unhappy because Lloyd was getting dangerously close to making money capable of reducing the estate's debt. With his usual rude demeanor, Lloyd bluntly stated that he already had his father's permission. Neumann narrowed his eyes and replied that he had no idea how Lloyd had managed to deceive the Baron. He then reminded Lloyd of his past behavior, claiming there was no possible reason for using the soldiers except personal greed. A smug smile spread across Lloyd's face as he openly admitted that the accusation sounded completely accurate. Then, within a fraction of a second, his entire expression transformed into something rough and untamed. The atmosphere instantly sharpened as Lloyd practically invited Neumann to settle things physically if that was what he wanted. Neumann clenched his teeth in fury. Watching Lloyd's reckless attitude, irritation exploded inside him. The knight stared at the fragile-looking young master in disbelief. Wanting to provoke him even further, Lloyd suddenly slammed his shovel into the ground. He scooped up a heavy pile of mud and hurled it directly into Neumann's face. The soldiers froze in absolute shock after witnessing their commander humiliated so openly. Mud dripped down Neumann's face as anger twisted his expression beyond restraint. Furious disbelief filled his voice as he accused Lloyd of insulting a knight's honor. Privately, Neumann burned with contempt, seeing Lloyd as nothing more than the worthless son of a poor baron destined for ruin. Meanwhile, Lloyd only swaggered even harder. Pretending not to hear the insult properly, he casually suggested they forget about ranks altogether and settle the matter through a fight. The shovel spun through his fingers like a frisbee before he pointed it directly at Neumann. Then Lloyd boldly proposed a duel. For a moment, Neumann was left speechless, but the boiling rage consuming him quickly won over reason. Grinding his teeth, he vowed to make Lloyd regret everything. Later that day, back at the mansion, Lloyd summoned Javier. After hearing about the duel scheduled 1 month later against Sir Neumann, Javier calmly questioned whether Lloyd was actually confident he could win. Lloyd reacted as though the question itself was ridiculous. Completely unbothered, he aggressively pointed out the obvious reality. Neumann was a low-level sword expert capable of using the Manhwa skill, while he himself was practically nobody. Lloyd openly mocked Javier for even asking such a thing, questioning whether he had truly thought the matter through at all. Javier quietly stared at him. Deep within, confusion mixed with irritation. Earlier, when Lloyd had suddenly thrown mud into Sir Neumann's face and challenged him to a duel, Javier had genuinely believed the young master had returned to his old hooligan behavior. But the more he thought about it, the less it felt impulsive. Everything seemed strangely calculated. Lloyd had intentionally requested separation from Javier before provoking Neumann. He had also assigned Sir Bayern as a substitute overseer to supervise the soldiers in advance. And now, after orchestrating everything so boldly, he casually admitted having no confidence in winning the duel. None of it made sense. To Javier, the entire situation felt unpleasantly suspicious. Secretly, the urge to cut Lloyd down where he stood became stronger and stronger. Meanwhile, Lloyd casually shifted the conversation and revealed the real reason he had called Javier. He wanted sword training. Specifically, he wanted Javier to teach him how to fight with a sword. Javier rejected the request instantly without even needing a moment to think. First, he explained that his only duty was to monitor Lloyd. Second, he bluntly stated that if trash like Lloyd learned swordsmanship, the people around him would only end up in even greater danger. Lloyd immediately complained that Javier somehow managed to insult him even harder while supposedly correcting himself. Still, he refused to back down. Then, with complete confidence, Lloyd proposed a deal. What if teaching him swordsmanship could cure Javier's insomnia? Javier froze. Inside, shock rippled through him as he wondered how Lloyd possibly knew about that condition. A sly grin spread across Lloyd's face. Deep down, he already knew everything because it had all been written in the novel. He even knew the exact cause behind Javier's insomnia. Within the world of the Knight of Blood and Iron, knights were generally divided into 4 ranks, and Javier currently stood right at the threshold between a high-level sword expert and a sword master. He was balancing on the border between human and superhuman. His senses had sharpened to such an extreme level that proper sleep had become nearly impossible. In other words, the insomnia was simply a side effect of approaching the swordmaster realm. Naturally, Javier himself had no way of knowing that while living in a remote backwater like this, Lloyd casually pointed out that pretending was pointless because exhaustion and insomnia were practically written all over Javier's face. After a long sigh, Javier finally agreed to give it a try. Lloyd immediately brightened up and excitedly warned him not to take back his words afterward. A faint smirk appeared on Javier's face as he calmly explained that Lloyd would fail anyway. There was no treatment he had not already attempted. He had tried sleep cognition therapy, medicinal herbs, aromatherapy, exercise, Eastern medicine, and countless other methods. But before he could continue further, everything abruptly collapsed. Javier suddenly fell asleep while hugging a pillow in his arms. Lloyd burst into laughter. Inside, triumph overflowed through him. He already knew exactly how Javier's insomnia would eventually be cured. In the original story, Javier had once accidentally fallen into deep sleep while listening to a magic spell. So Lloyd simply took that concept to another level. He had read aloud from his reinforced concrete textbook instead. According to Lloyd's shameless confidence, the textbook was at least 18 times more sleep-inducing than any magic spell in existence. With an insolent grin plastered across his face, Lloyd victoriously declared that Javier's swordsmanship now belonged to him. The next morning arrived with the rising sun, and with it came the moment Javier intended to fulfill his promise. Standing in the courtyard, Javier calmly ordered Lloyd to run 50 laps around the perimeter. For a brief moment, Lloyd simply stared at him. Then, without arguing, he turned around and started running immediately, causing Javier's eyes to narrow slightly in surprise. Deep within, disbelief surfaced as he watched Lloyd continue without complaint. Seeing Lloyd obediently follow instructions so seriously felt almost unnatural. Lap after lap, Lloyd kept running around the courtyard, yet despite his growing exhaustion, he never stopped talking. Every time he completed another lap, he tossed out another complaint before continuing onward. He loudly groaned about how much he hated this kind of training and demanded to be taught actual techniques instead. After another lap, a smug grin spread across his face as he mockingly pointed out that Javier had probably expected him to refuse outright. Then, while struggling for breath during the next round, Lloyd haughtily declared that Javier had likely planned to use that refusal as proof that he lacked determination and therefore did not deserve proper instruction. Each of those comments struck Javier directly in the heart. Meanwhile, Lloyd burst into triumphant laughter as he continued running, proudly announcing that he was absolutely going to finish all 50 laps now. At that exact moment, the system suddenly informed him that the passive skill annoying brat had risen to level 4, while adding a mocking description claiming that the lump attached to his neck was practically begging everyone around him for a slap. Lloyd immediately snapped back at the system, accusing it of completely inventing that nonsense before telling it to buzz off. Still gasping heavily, he forced his legs to continue moving. Deep down, however, his thoughts gradually drifted elsewhere. Honestly, this training was difficult. Pretending otherwise would have been a lie. But compared to the life he once lived back in Korea, this was far better. Back then, there had not even been a family waiting to welcome him home. Every morning, he woke alone inside a tiny boarding house room. He spent his days hauling bricks onto the roofs of 4-story buildings, then worked through the night loading and unloading delivery trucks, all just to avoid starving to death. Through all of it, he had clung desperately to the belief that things would eventually improve. Again and again, he had encouraged himself to endure a little longer. Someday it would get better. He worked harder than anyone else. Surely he deserved that much. Just a little more. A little more. Lloyd suddenly shook away the memories crowding his mind. Compared to that pain and despair, this level of suffering was nothing. That familiar brash smile returned to his face as he continued running without stopping. Watching him carefully, Javier finally reconsidered his judgment. If Lloyd truly possessed that level of determination, then Javier decided he would genuinely teach him his sword-fighting techniques. Later that day, Neumann visited Baron Frontera's mansion and reported the events of the morning directly to Baron Arcos. Arcos expressed deep disbelief over Lloyd's disrespect, especially toward a knight who had protected their family for 5 generations. Though he admitted Lloyd had recently appeared to come to his senses, he now realized that assumption had been mistaken. Even so, there was no legitimate reason to stop the duel now that it had been formally accepted. Still, as Lloyd's father and the lord of the estate, Arcos firmly instructed Neumann not to go too far. Lloyd was still his heir, and the duel should only be severe enough to force him back to his senses without seriously injuring him. Neumann respectfully bowed and accepted the order. Inside, however, delight spread through him. Duels did not always proceed according to plan. If he happened to cut down that arrogant hooligan during the fight, then so be it. And if the Baron dared object afterward, Neumann calmly considered killing both the Baron and Baroness as well, before disguising everything as suicide. Then, just as he had always planned, he would leave this insignificant village behind and move on to somewhere far greater. Thanks to Lloyd's reckless behavior, everything was progressing even faster than expected. Deep within, Neumann laughed viciously to himself. With everything finally set into motion, an entire month passed before the long-awaited duel arrived. The gentle sunlight of early spring spread across the estate while the villagers carried out their usual morning chores. Yet, despite the peaceful atmosphere, dozens of people gradually gathered around the training grounds, all eager to witness the duel between Lloyd Frontera and Sir Neumann. Most of them already expected the outcome. In their eyes, Lloyd Frontera was destined to lose. Nearby, the Frontera family and their guards watched the arena with visible anxiety as Neumann calmly stepped forward with his sword in hand. He formally asked whether Lloyd was prepared. In response, Lloyd casually pulled the shovel strapped to his back. Complete confidence radiated from him as he boldly declared himself ready to knock Neumann's lights out. The moment the crowd saw the weapon in his hands, confused murmurs exploded everywhere. People stared in disbelief at the iron shovel, unable to comprehend that Lloyd genuinely intended to fight Sir Neumann with construction equipment. Javier silently observed the weapon before quietly realizing that this was the very solid iron shovel Lloyd had personally requested from the blacksmith. Meanwhile, Baron Arcos lowered his head in disappointment. Deep down, he concluded that everything Lloyd had done until now must have been some absurd joke after all. But Javier could not agree. Inside, he immediately rejected that conclusion. When he thought back on the past month, nothing about Lloyd's actions resembled a joke. During the quiet hours before dawn, Lloyd had endured basic training without complaint. Throughout the day, he constantly rushed around construction sites while teaching the village workers about Ondal systems. Then, even after exhausting himself completely, he continued practicing swordsmanship until the moment he collapsed into sleep. That was not the behavior of someone fooling around. If anything, Master Lloyd seemed more serious now than ever before. At last, Baron Arcos loudly announced the official beginning of the duel between Lloyd Frontera and Sir Neumann. Neumann immediately raised his sword, though he still kept the blade sheathed within its scabbard. Across from him, Lloyd assumed an awkward-looking stance while wearing the same arrogant grin as always. Watching the posture, Javier frowned deeply. The stance looked sloppy and unimpressive at first glance. Then Neumann moved. Infuriated by Lloyd's mocking attitude, he charged forward and angrily demanded to know whether Lloyd was making fun of him. The instant the attack arrived, Lloyd thrust his shovel forward. The incoming strike was cleanly deflected. Shock instantly spread across both Javier and Baron Arcos' faces. Neumann himself gritted his teeth in frustration before immediately swinging upward once more. Yet once again, Lloyd's shovel intercepted the attack directly head on. Javier's eyes narrowed sharply. Inside, astonishment spread through him as he analyzed Lloyd's movements. Every action was unbelievably efficient, stripped of unnecessary motion, and adapted purely for practical combat. To Javier, it almost felt as though their traditional swordsmanship had evolved across countless generations into something entirely different. Meanwhile, Lloyd secretly grinned to himself. Why was everyone acting so shocked? Any Korean man would know how to do this. To him, this was simply the essence of modern hand-to-hand combat, bayonet training, and beyond that, a shovel was far more dangerous than most people realized. After all, it was strong enough to slice directly through thick tree roots. Lloyd suddenly jabbed forward with his shovel, forcing Neumann to step aside to avoid the strike. Then, without warning, Lloyd shoved the shovel beneath his foot and leaped onto it. The next moment, he began bouncing up and down on the shovel like a pogo stick. While hopping around the arena, Lloyd burst into shameless laughter and loudly provoked Neumann, repeatedly taunting him to come at him already. Watching the ridiculous scene unfold, Javier frowned deeply in confusion. Just moments ago, Lloyd had displayed efficient and refined combat movements. Yet now, he was bouncing around like a complete lunatic. Javier could no longer tell whether Lloyd was taking the duel seriously or turning the entire thing into a joke. Unfortunately for Neumann, the provocation worked perfectly. Fury overtook him as he charged forward once again. At that moment, Lloyd immediately shifted his stance. Deep within, his thoughts sharpened completely. The first weapon he had prepared to destroy Neumann was the shovel itself. The second was the basic swordsmanship footwork Javier had drilled into him over the past month. The instant Neumann closed the distance, Lloyd moved. His body flowed with surprising efficiency as he attacked and defended like a genuine swordsman. Each movement carried practical precision instead of flashy elegance. Meanwhile, pain began spreading through Neumann's hands every time the shovel collided against his weapon. Internally, frustration boiled within him as he wondered how a useless drunkard obsessed with alcohol could possibly possess this much strength. But Lloyd's focus never wavered. Instead, he activated the third strategy he had prepared. A faint glow suddenly wrapped around the shovel in his hands. At once, the system informed him that the skill, Expansion Shoveling Level 1, had activated. According to the description, the shovel and its wielder had effectively become one, granting increased physical abilities whenever he held a shovel. Inside, Lloyd immediately recalled how he had accumulated the RP necessary to obtain the skill. The approval points gained during training with Javier, combined with the increasing approval from the Baron and Baroness after witnessing their son genuinely working hard for the first time in his life, had gradually pushed his RP total all the way to 97. At some point during that process, the system had offered him the chance to learn the skill extension, and to Lloyd, it had become the greatest skill he had obtained so far. Across from him, Neumann exhaled heavily before finally unsheathing his sword completely. Deep down, irritation and caution mixed together. Against an ordinary civilian, he had never imagined he would actually need to go this far. The moment Javier saw Neumann fully draw the blade, his expression hardened instantly. Mana heart! Lloyd could clearly hear the rhythm of Neumann's pounding heart. The muscles surrounding it expanded and contracted powerfully as blood surged through his body in steady pulses. At the same time, Neumann's sword began glowing faintly while mana flowed across the blade, coating it in a thin layer of mysterious energy. Neumann coldly declared that the duel was only beginning. Then he moved. The distance between them vanished in an instant as Neumann swung directly toward Lloyd's neck. Javier's eyes widened in astonishment. For ordinary people, awakening Mana Heart required years of training. Even talented individuals needed at least 5 years to achieve it. Someone without proper qualifications could spend over a decade chasing it without success. There was simply no possible way for Lloyd to block an attack infused with that much mana. Meanwhile, Neumann's blade descended with overwhelming force. Inside, vicious intent exploded through him as he prepared to shatter both the shovel and Lloyd's skull in a single strike. Nearby, Baron Arcos and the Baroness watched in horror as they realized Neumann had completely lost control against their son. At that moment, the shovel moved again. A loud clang erupted as Sir Neumann's sword was violently shoved aside, swatted away as easily as a fly. He desperately tried to withstand the pressure crushing against his blade, yet his strength failed him. A strange sensation spread through his body as the mana inside his mana heart drained away with a sudden rush. The instant Lloyd sensed the opening, delight flashed across his face. It was time for his fourth weapon. He swung the shovel with brutal force. Bam! The strike smashed directly into Sir Neumann's face. Blood sprayed from his mouth as one of his teeth flew into the air, the sheer impact snapping his head violently to the side. Time itself seemed to slow as Lloyd struck again, driving the handle of the shovel upward beneath Neumann's chin. Sir Neumann staggered helplessly, and Lloyd raised the shovel high overhead before bringing it crashing down onto the back of Neumann's skull with pure brute force. The impact made Neumann's eyes bulge outward. A cry burst from him as all strength vanished from his legs, and his body slammed heavily onto the ground. The spectators froze in complete shock. None of them could understand what they had just witnessed. The impossible result left the entire crowd whispering in confusion and disbelief as they struggled to process the sight before them. Even the Baron remained stunned. Slowly raising his hand, he hesitantly declared Lloyd Frontera the winner of the duel, his voice still shaken by the absurdity of what had happened. Half conscious on the ground, Sir Neumann could not accept reality. Deep within, disbelief consumed him as he questioned how a sword expert like himself could have lost to someone like Lloyd. Lloyd stepped closer and reminded him of the outcome of the duel. Then, without hesitation, he declared that the real beating was only beginning. The Baron immediately shouted at Lloyd, demanding to know what he was doing and reminding him that the duel had already ended. Desperation filled Sir Neumann's voice as he begged Lloyd to stop humiliating him further. Lloyd gave no response. Instead, he swung the shovel again. The blows continued mercilessly. Lloyd repeatedly slammed the shovel into Neumann's battered body, strike after strike raining down without pause. The Baron exploded in fury and ordered him to stop immediately. Soldiers rushed forward and grabbed Lloyd, trying to restrain him as they shouted that the duel was over. One of the knights, Bayern, stared in disbelief and questioned whether Lloyd had completely lost his mind. Javier, however, viewed the scene differently. Inside, uncertainty stirred within him as he admitted that he could not tell what Lloyd was truly thinking. Lloyd eventually calmed himself and told the soldiers to release him. He took several deep breaths, steadying his nerves. Then, suddenly, he lunged forward again and resumed thrashing Neumann with the shovel while the soldiers struggled to hold him back. Javier silently observed the scene with growing suspicion. From his perspective, Lloyd was not attacking randomly at all. Every strike appeared deliberate, carefully aimed to inflict pain across every part of Neumann's body. What unsettled Javier most was Lloyd's calm expression. Lloyd looked like a man who had already predicted everything that would happen next, as though he already knew the future awaiting them. 15 days earlier, during one of Javier's swordsmanship lessons, Lloyd had brazenly demanded to be taught the Astrahan core technique. Lloyd questioned why Javier looked so alarmed, as though he had been asked to teach theft instead of swordsmanship. He casually explained his understanding of the core method, describing it as a technique that absorbed mana from the surroundings, rather than relying solely on the mana conjured by the individual. Javier froze in shock and demanded to know how Lloyd had learned about it. The reaction was understandable. Javier had never spoken to anyone about the technique because it was still incomplete. Without the slightest shame, Lloyd fabricated an absurd explanation, claiming Javier talked about the technique in his sleep every night after being tucked into bed with a lullaby. Deep within, Javier found himself disturbed by Lloyd's shameless confidence. Yet no matter how strange the explanation sounded, he could not think of any other possible way Lloyd could have learned about the unfinished technique. Javier reluctantly apologized and admitted he could not teach it because the method was still incomplete. Lloyd immediately seized on that single word. With a smug grin, he interpreted Javier's answer as proof that the technique would be taught once it was perfected. Suspicion lingered in Javier's eyes, but he admitted that if perfection became possible, then yes, he would teach it. He still could not understand where Lloyd's confidence was coming from. Lloyd then began laying out his theory. He guessed that Javier had been trying to absorb external mana and merge it directly with the mana heart, only for the process to fail because the mana heart rejected it like a foreign object. From Lloyd's perspective, the solution was simple. Instead of forcing the absorbed mana into the mana heart itself, the mana should be condensed separately nearby and controlled externally. He compared the concept to an auxiliary engine working beside the main engine, connected yet separate at the same time. Lloyd finished his explanation with complete confidence, sounding thoroughly pleased with his own idea. Although Javier did not understand what an engine was, he admitted that the theory sounded surprisingly plausible. Shock filled him as he questioned how Lloyd could possibly think of something like that. Still wearing that unbearably smug expression, Lloyd casually brushed it off and claimed he had only been throwing ideas around randomly. He seemed delighted that his explanation had actually made sense. That expression unsettled Javier once again. Privately, he became convinced Lloyd was hiding something, yet despite his suspicions, the result was undeniable. In that very moment, Javier succeeded in perfecting the Azrahan core technique that had tormented him for so long. On his very first attempt, he successfully reached 3 circles. With further training, he became certain he could eventually achieve 4, 5, or perhaps even more. At the same time, the system notified Lloyd that Javier's approval rating had increased by 5 points. Lloyd, however, showed no interest in properly learning how to use a mana heart. He loudly insisted that he had no intention of wasting time on all of that. The only thing he wanted to learn was the absorption process itself. He had no interest in gathering mana from the air, and only wanted to absorb the mana that came into direct contact with his body. At that moment, Javier finally understood Lloyd's true intention. Within his mind, he realized that Lloyd had calculated everything from the very beginning. Lloyd had learned that technique for one purpose alone, defeating Sir Neumann. And in the end, he had accomplished it with ease. The Baron finally erupted in rage, shouting at Lloyd to stop immediately. He declared that he would no longer tolerate the dishonoring of a knight. The moment those words reached him, Lloyd halted. A slow breath escaped him as he repeated the phrase about a knight's honor in a calm voice. Then he pointed toward the table and told the Baron to look beneath the tablecloth before deciding whether such words truly suited Sir Neumann. Confusion spread across the Baron's face as he pulled away the cloth and discovered a pile of letters hidden underneath. The instant he read one of them, shock overtook him completely. His eyes widened as the truth sank in. Lloyd calmly explained that the letters were exchanges between Sir Neumann and Tordes, the man responsible for defrauding the Baron in the real estate deal. Every detail had been recorded within them. The financial condition of the estate, the lordship's preferences, and even plans involving forged real estate documents. Sir Neumann's jaw dropped in horror. Deep within, panic consumed him as he questioned how Lloyd had discovered letters that had been hidden inside a wall. Meanwhile, Lloyd secretly grinned to himself. Javier had originally found those letters much later in the story, but Lloyd had sent Padong to search for them the previous night. The Baron was shaken to the core. His body slumped heavily into the chair as the weight of betrayal crushed him. Watching him, Lloyd quietly acknowledged the truth within his heart. The Baron truly was a kind man, exactly as described in the story. Most rulers would have demanded Neumann's execution immediately, but Lloyd also understood something else. A kind leader and a good leader were not always the same thing. Lloyd then offered a suggestion regarding Sir Neumann's punishment. The Baron slowly lifted his head and asked what Lloyd had in mind. Lloyd proposed releasing a vicious mouse onto Neumann's head. If the mouse managed to injure him, Neumann would be exiled from the territory. If not, he would merely be demoted to a foot soldier and given a chance to repent. The crowd instantly burst into confused whispers. Many could not understand why a mouse of all things would be used for punishment. Yet as realization slowly spread among them, the atmosphere shifted. The Baron fell into deep thought as he understood Lloyd's true meaning. The test itself was not important. What mattered was forcing Neumann to live constantly aware that a harsher punishment could descend upon him at any moment. It was mercy mixed with fear. Bayern praised the decision as wise, calling it both generous and a warning to everyone else. At last, the Baron reached his conclusion and declared that Lloyd's proposal would be carried out exactly as suggested. Lloyd then turned toward Sir Neumann and calmly asked whether he had any objections. Bruised, battered, and trembling, Neumann immediately accepted the decision and expressed gratitude for the mercy shown to him. But Lloyd viewed mercy very differently. Within his mind, cold certainty settled in. Giving a guilty person a merciful outcome would never make them repent. People like that did not change. They only became more stubborn, more calculating, and more desperate to climb back above the person who spared them. Sir Neumann lowered his gaze, his body trembling with rage and humiliation. Deep within, hatred boiled violently as he swore revenge against Baron Frontera and Lloyd alike. Lloyd noticed the expression immediately and casually remarked that it was nice to finally see Neumann smiling, though he coldly added that it would also be the last time. Confusion spread across Neumann's battered face as he questioned what Lloyd meant. At that moment, his eyes caught sight of a small hamster resting on Lloyd's shoulder. Lloyd calmly held out a red sunflower seed and fed it to the creature. Then, 1 second later, Lloyd suddenly hurled the tiny animal high into the air before stepping backward. A chilling calm settled over his face as he declared that the best way to seek forgiveness was to remember remember that none existed. And then it happened. The hamster leapt downward. Lloyd immediately ordered Podong to step on Sir Neumann, and the creature responded at once. An enormous 30-foot hamster came crashing down directly onto Neumann in a devastating nosedive. The entire scene unfolded so suddenly that Neumann could not even react. Lloyd merely chuckled as he raised one hand and coldly announced Neumann's exile. And just like that, the rotten apple of the territory was finally gone. Lloyd stood overlooking the area while making full use of his surveying and design skills. His eyes carefully traced the geography as he gathered one data point after another. Nearby, Podong tirelessly dug through the earth exactly as instructed. Javier watched the enormous hamster in confusion and questioned what Sir Podong was doing. Lloyd explained that Podong was carving out a road. Now that the once pitiful soldiers finally resembled proper construction workers, the real project could begin. He then spoke enthusiastically about an ancient city called Rome, describing how obsessed it had been with roads. Using the same methods behind the legendary Appian Way, Lloyd intended to construct a road stretching from the Lord's Manor all the way to the base of the Eastern Mountain. Javier still could not understand the purpose and questioned why a road was necessary at all. Lloyd merely told him to wait and see, confidently declaring that the project would put their territory on the map. But Javier's attention had shifted elsewhere. He questioned where Lloyd had suddenly acquired all this knowledge. Lloyd had created an unheard of heating system and somehow summoned a high-level creature out of nowhere. Javier could no longer suppress the doubt growing within him as he questioned whether the person standing before him was truly Lloyd Frontera. At that exact moment, the system warned Lloyd that Javier had begun suspecting his identity. A chill shot through Lloyd's heart. Within his mind, panic immediately surged. From what he knew of Javier's personality in the original story, discovering that someone else had stolen the body of his lord's son would almost certainly end with Javier driving a sword through him without hesitation. Still, Lloyd quickly steadied himself. Thankfully, he possessed a special skill perfectly suited for situations like this. Without missing a beat, Lloyd suddenly exploded with dramatic indignation and claimed that he had simply studied in secret while nobody was watching. Javier stared at him in disbelief and pointed out that Lloyd spent nearly all his time drinking. Lloyd instantly fired back, asking whether Javier had been monitoring him every second of every day. He loudly questioned whether Javier knew what he did before sleeping or even while using the bathroom. Javier ignored the nonsense and pressed further, demanding an explanation for the summoning magic. Even skilled mages with decades of training struggled with such techniques. Lloyd immediately turned the argument around. He questioned how Javier himself could manipulate mana so skillfully at such a young age, despite never having a teacher. Lloyd dramatically concluded that Javier must simply be a genius. Javier awkwardly denied ever thinking of himself that way. Lloyd instantly seized the opening and argued that if Javier could be a genius, then there was no reason he could not be one as well. He shamelessly declared that he had simply been born with a natural talent for summoning. Faced with Lloyd's relentless stubbornness, Javier ultimately fell silent. Lloyd immediately turned away and declared that if there were no more questions, he was leaving because he still had work to do. As he marched off with exaggerated confidence, relief exploded inside him. Deep down, he desperately hoped the excuse had worked. Before departing, Lloyd instructed Bayern, now serving as the first knight, to oversee the road construction in his absence. Bayern respectfully accepted the order and assured Lloyd that everything would be handled properly while wishing him a safe trip. Javier approached Lloyd from behind and declared that he would accompany him, reminding Lloyd that watching over him was part of his duty. Lloyd looked baffled by the statement and casually replied that Javier had obviously been coming along from the start, questioning why he was saying something so obvious. Javier then asked where they were headed. Lloyd answered that they were going somewhere far away to reclaim money that had been stolen from them. The two soon departed for their next destination, a small border town known as Ludinia. Meanwhile, inside a local inn of Ludinia, chaos erupted around Tordes, the swindler responsible for the real estate fraud. Furious over his recent losses, he slammed his fist onto the table in frustration. He could not believe he had lost such an enormous amount of money and became convinced some kind of trick must have been involved. His bodyguard calmly reminded him that gambling had always worked that way and pointed out that Tordes himself had built his fortune through the same methods. Then, in an indifferent tone, the bodyguard warned that if Tordes could no longer afford his protection, he would leave immediately. Panic spread across Tordes' face as he hurriedly insisted that he still had enough money to pay. Desperation filled his voice as he begged the bodyguard not to leave him. The bodyguard coldly warned him that the moment payment stopped, he would disappear. Trying to reassure himself, Tortoise muttered that he could always trick another easy target and recover his fortune. For now, his priority was hiding from the people pursuing him. At that exact moment, the inn's door slammed open. A familiar voice casually questioned whether Tortoise had been talking about him. Startled, Tortoise rose from his seat and demanded to know who the intruder was. Lloyd smiled brightly and remarked that it made sense Tortoise did not recognize his face. Then, with his usual shameless swagger, Lloyd proudly introduced himself as Lloyd Frontera and asked whether the name sounded familiar. The color instantly drained from Tortoise's face. Horror struck him as realization dawned. His bodyguard, however, remained completely calm and simply asked whether he should kill Lloyd. As Lloyd confidently stepped closer, Tortoise frantically looked around before panicking completely. Instead of fighting, he desperately urged the bodyguard to run. The bodyguard obeyed immediately, grabbing Tortoise under one arm before launching through the back window in a violent burst. Glass shattered everywhere as they crashed outside. But the instant they landed, the escape route ahead was already blocked. Javier stood waiting calmly with his sword unsheathed. With a single motion, he sliced through the empty air as killing intent filled the atmosphere. In a cold voice, Javier ordered the bodyguard to leave Tortoise behind and walk away quietly. Otherwise, he warned, the man would be treated as a co-conspirator. At the same time, Javier silently acknowledged something unsettling. Everything had unfolded exactly as Lloyd predicted. Earlier, Lloyd had casually instructed him to wait near the back window because they would undoubtedly attempt to escape that way. The bodyguard looked down at Javier with open disdain, questioning whether someone so young even knew how to properly hold a sword. As he spoke, a black sphere of magic formed above his palm. From the shattered-in window, Lloyd quietly observed the scene unfold. In the original story, Javier had only confronted Tortoise after losing Baron Frontera. Driven by vengeance, he eventually tracked down the swindler and faced this very bodyguard. It had been Javier's first encounter with a dark enchanter, and at the time, he struggled badly against gravitational magic. A grin slowly spread across Lloyd's face. That had been the story in the novel. Now things were different. The bodyguard suddenly hurled the black sphere toward Javier. The dark traces trailing behind it twisted violently through the air and shot forward together. Javier immediately swung his sword. The blade sliced cleanly through the magical sphere, scattering the dark energy apart. The bodyguard clicked his tongue in irritation before launching his next attack. His fist tightened and he lunged forward with a crushing punch. The blow landed directly against Javier. Javier staggered backward as the ground beneath him cracked apart. His foot dug deeply into the earth while he forcibly absorbed the impact. Lloyd calmly analyzed the situation. In the original story, Javier had only been an ordinary high-level sword expert during this battle. But now, Javier possessed a triple circle mana heart. Javier swiftly swung his sword again, cutting away the lingering dark enchantment surrounding him. Realization crossed his face as he recognized the nature of the magic. It was a spell capable of increasing a target's weight through gravitational force. Sweat poured down the bodyguard's face the moment he realized the battle could no longer be won. Without hesitation, he leapt high into the air and abandoned the fight entirely, loudly declaring that his contract was now void. Tortoise screamed furiously at the fleeing man, but the bodyguard did not even glance back. Javier slowly approached the terrified swindler and coldly questioned whether he understood how severe the crime of defrauding a noble family truly was. Fear overwhelmed Tortoise completely. As he stepped backward, his foot slipped, sending him crashing helplessly into the barrels behind him. Javier raised his sword and declared that he would sever Tortoise's legs and force him to crawl all the way to the courthouse. The blade descended, but before it could strike, Lloyd suddenly dashed between them and blocked the attack. He immediately shouted at Javier to stop, warning him that he was losing control. Lloyd pointed out that if Tortoise were brought before the court in that condition, execution would be inevitable. Javier froze in shock. Deep within, confusion spread through him. He could hardly believe Lloyd was showing mercy toward another person. Still, Javier listened. The two of them dragged Tortoise back into the inn, tied him tightly to a chair, and sat him down as he trembled uncontrollably in fear. Meanwhile, Lloyd smiled casually and tried to calm him. He admitted that greed tempted everyone at times, and claimed he could understand why Tortoise had taken advantage of the opportunity before him. Lloyd even remarked that executing someone over such greed felt excessively harsh. Tortoise trembled as he desperately asked whether Lloyd truly intended to forgive him. Lloyd casually confirmed that he had no intention of dragging him to court. Then, with complete confidence, he pointed out that Tortoise should naturally feel grateful enough to return all of the Baron's remaining assets. Relief instantly washed over Tortoise. In his desperation to survive, he eagerly agreed, claiming he would gladly hand everything over if it meant receiving forgiveness. But Lloyd immediately corrected him. Returning the stolen assets was merely the beginning. If Tortoise truly wanted forgiveness, there was still one more thing he needed to do. Terrified, Tortoise hurriedly declared that he would obey absolutely anything Lloyd requested. Lloyd then presented a contract and casually explained that all Tortoise had to do was sign it. Confusion spread across Tortoise's face as he questioned what kind of contract it was. Lloyd calmly described it as an ordinary employment contract with a proper salary included. However, there was one small condition. 80% of Tortoise's wages would be withheld as repayment for the money stolen from the Frontera family. At that rate, the debt would only take 520 years to fully repay. The color drained completely from Tortoise's face. Even Javier immediately understood Lloyd's true intentions. Deep down, he realized Lloyd had never planned on forgiving the man so easily. Meanwhile, Lloyd secretly clicked his tongue in amusement. Killing a man who owed him money would have been a complete waste. Instead, Lloyd fully intended to squeeze every last coin possible out of Tortoise for the rest of his life. Tortoise nearly burst into tears as he cried out that he had never seen such an outrageously unfair contract. Lloyd's expression instantly turned cold. He widened his eyes and calmly replied that no one was forcing Tortoise to sign anything. If he disliked the agreement so much, they could simply head to court instead. The threat shattered what little resistance Tortoise still had. Sweat and tears poured down his face like rain as he helplessly signed the contract. Not long afterward, the three of them boarded a horse carriage and began the journey back home. During the trip, Javier pointed out that the money recovered from Tordes should at least relieve the territory from worrying about interest payments for the next few months. Lloyd, however, had completely different plans. To Javier's surprise, Lloyd revealed that he intended to invest the money into hiring additional workers. The 30 soldiers currently helping with construction were nowhere near enough for the scale of work he planned to undertake. Still, a concern lingered within Lloyd's mind. Given his terrible reputation as a hooligan, he doubted any villagers would willingly respond even if he posted recruitment notices. A few days later, back in the Frontera barony, Lloyd came up with an idea. He placed a large recruitment board in public view announcing that workers were wanted, offering 20 gold per week and directing applicants toward the tourney square for more details. To Lloyd's complete shock, villagers immediately began lining up in huge numbers. Unable to understand what he was seeing, Lloyd questioned whether these people had not hated him until recently. Javier calmly admitted that they absolutely had. However, things had changed. Lloyd had successfully installed affordable Ondal systems, dealt with the traitor threatening the territory, and even summoned a powerful creature. In the eyes of the people, he was now considered trustworthy and talented. Lloyd could hardly believe it. Within his mind, he struggled to understand how people's opinions could change so easily over just those few actions. Before he could think further, a young man nervously approached him regarding the work contract. Lloyd hurriedly snapped back to reality and awkwardly urged the man to sign it, but before doing so, the villager first expressed heartfelt gratitude. Every winter, his child had suffered terribly from severe colds during cold spells, yet thanks to Lloyd's Ondal system, they no longer had to worry about that problem this year. The sincere gratitude caught Lloyd completely off guard. Awkwardly, he replied that he was glad to hear it, and despite knowing that all of his actions had originally been driven by greed, Lloyd suddenly found himself feeling strangely embarrassed. The young man hesitantly added that he had a relative living in the neighboring Lacona territory, and that relative wanted to know whether Lloyd would also accept an Ondal order from outside the Frontera lands. The moment Lloyd heard that, excitement exploded within him. At last, the first stage of his grand plan had begun. Deep down, he laughed triumphantly. He had not installed all those Ondal systems at a loss for nothing. By using travel expenses as an excuse, he could raise the price for outside territories and make an enormous profit. A cocky smile immediately spread across Lloyd's face as he agreed to accept the order, though he casually mentioned that additional travel costs would naturally be required. Watching him from the side, Javier immediately noticed that familiar suspicious expression again. At that moment, he finally realized the true reason Lloyd had willingly built the Ondal systems at a loss. Yet another question soon emerged within him. If profit from Ondals had been Lloyd's objective all along, then why was he so determined to build that road toward the mountain? After hiring the workers, the group moved toward the edge of the mountain range. Lloyd suddenly called out to Javier and calmly declared that before long, the mountain standing before them would be stripped completely bare. Confused, Javier questioned what he meant. Lloyd explained that Andal systems consumed enormous amounts of fuel. The trees in the surrounding area would never be enough to sustain long-term demand. Javier was stunned. He could not understand why Lloyd would spread Andals everywhere despite already knowing such a problem would occur. But Lloyd had already anticipated that concern. That was precisely why he had begun constructing the Appian-style road. At the end of that road, they would mine black coal. Then Lloyd burst into an evil laugh, sticking out his tongue while shamelessly explaining the next stage of his scheme. Once people became accustomed to the comfort of Andals, they would never want to give them up. At that point, he planned to sell black coal at an enormous markup. Naturally, he claimed the people of his own territory would receive a discount. A very tiny discount. Watching Lloyd laugh like a villain, Javier silently concluded that Lloyd was unbelievably sneaky and devious. Lloyd immediately guessed exactly what Javier was thinking and openly asked whether Javier now viewed him that way. Then his expression sharpened as he reminded Javier of reality. If they failed to do this, there would be no possible way for the territory to repay its crushing debts. Javier flinched in surprise. For a brief moment, it almost felt as though Lloyd had read directly into his mind. After gathering himself, Javier admitted that Lloyd's plan truly was the best available solution for the moment. However, he pointed out that the barons before them had not ignored the black coal deposits out of ignorance. Several attempts had already been made in the past. Lloyd immediately interrupted because he already knew the reason those attempts had failed. The mines always collapsed due to weak bedrock. But unlike the previous generations, Lloyd possessed something they never had: modern excavation knowledge. Filled with confidence, Lloyd declared that he could solve the problem before enthusiastically urging everyone forward because there was still an overwhelming amount of work left to do. Meanwhile, Javier silently observed him once more. Even the term Lloyd used the shield tunneling method was something Javier had never heard before. Still, despite all the mystery surrounding Lloyd, Javier chose to trust him for now. Their lord had changed, and this new Lloyd Frontera clearly had a plan. Lloyd completely shut himself inside the mine construction site. Day after day, he surveyed the terrain, analyzed the environment, and searched endlessly for solutions. At times, absurd fantasies even crossed his mind. He imagined screaming at the top of his lungs and somehow summoning an entire luxury Gangnam apartment building out of nowhere. Of course, reality was nowhere near that convenient. Still, Lloyd remained buried in work. Using his architectural design skills, he endlessly drafted construction plans by hand, but the process was painfully slow. Eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed him and he groaned in frustration, wishing he could simply summon 100 undead workers who demanded no wages. The system immediately mocked his complaint, dryly informing him that if he disliked his current skill so much, he was free to return to drawing everything manually by hand again. Lloyd instantly straightened up and rejected the idea without hesitation. No matter how exhausting it was, this skill remained incredibly valuable. Thanks to the Neumann incident, Lloyd had successfully raised the approval ratings of the Baron, the Baroness, Javier, and Bayern, earning himself 639 RP. Using those points, he had gone on a massive leveling spree and unlocked all sorts of useful skills. Now, however, his focus returned to the mine itself. He needed a safe route through the mountain. Activating his intermediate surveying skill alongside GPR scanning, Lloyd began examining the underground terrain. The skill allowed him to see up to 5 meters beneath the surface, making it possible to identify stable paths through the weak bedrock. But even after finding a route, another major problem remained. The excavation speed was far too slow. Human labor alone would take forever, and the workers exhausted themselves too quickly. Meanwhile, Podong had collapsed sick from overworking during the road construction and the constant long-distance hauling tasks. Even if the creature recovered, its enormous size would make underground excavation far too dangerous. Then suddenly inspiration struck Lloyd. That was the answer. Immediately, he opened the system window and selected the random summon game. Even after all his upgrades, he still possessed enough RP to spare. A bright light exploded outward. A massive magic circle formed in midair as space itself trembled violently. Within the distorted air, a hazy silhouette slowly emerged before finally revealing its form. It was a tiny rattlesnake named Bangul. She was plump, barely 4 inches long, and possessed an oversized round head with glimmering little eyes. Despite being a snake, she somehow looked strangely adorable. Lloyd stared at her in confusion while trying to figure out her purpose. At first glance, she looked useless. useless. He even wondered whether she had simply been summoned for assassination purposes and questioned whether she possessed poison. But then he remembered his first impression of Padang. That creature had seemed useless too. Surely Bangul also possessed some hidden ability. Lloyd immediately asked whether she could grow larger using sunflower seeds just like Padang. Bangul nodded. Then he questioned whether she possessed a special skill as well. Once again, Bangul nodded proudly. Excitement instantly filled Lloyd's face as he eagerly asked her to demonstrate it. Bangul visibly brightened with happiness and wriggled excitedly. Lloyd quickly handed her a red sunflower seed for testing. After swallowing it, Bangul lowered her oversized head toward the tunnel floor and opened her mouth wide. Several weeks later, the project was finally underway. At the very front of the shield tunneling machine, an enlarged Bangul continuously dug through the mountain by devouring the dirt in massive quantities. Inside the shield, Bangul swung her oversized head from side to side while devouring every bit of dirt and rock in sight. After some time, her stomach began wriggling strangely, and her tiny tail started rattling. The moment Lloyd noticed it, he loudly warned Javier that it was coming. Javier instantly moved into position. He removed his coat, unsheathed his sword, and prepared himself. Step 2 of the process began. Bangul launched steel dung. With a violent burst, blazing red-hot steel bars shot into the air. Immediately afterward came the third step. Javier swung his sword with perfect precision. The scorching steel bars were sliced apart into perfectly uniform lengths by the expert swordsman's blade. Then came the fourth step. The blacksmiths moved with remarkable coordination as they bent the freshly cut steel exactly according to Lloyd's measurements, creating steel segments sturdy enough to support the surrounding earth. Meanwhile, Javier silently questioned his own life choices. Deep down, disbelief filled him as he wondered why a knight like himself had somehow ended up underground slicing apart the droppings of a giant snake. Once Lloyd finished inspecting the work, he loudly ordered the shield forward. The dozens of civil engineers repeated the command together before straining against the massive lever connected to the shield. Slowly, the enormous structure crawled deeper into the tunnel. Lloyd wiped away sweat as exhaustion weighed heavily on him. Within his mind, he acknowledged how dangerously thin the oxygen had become. Without the ventilation pipe he had installed earlier, everyone inside the tunnel would have collapsed unconscious already. Javier urged Lloyd to leave the tunnel and rest like the other workers, but Lloyd immediately rejected the suggestion. As the person in charge, he believed he needed to remain on site alongside the workers. At heart, memories from his previous life resurfaced. Too many bosses in Korea had hidden behind their titles while refusing to step onto construction sites themselves. Lloyd had sworn long ago that he would never become that kind of leader, so he endured the exhaustion and stayed. At the same time, he continuously used his intermediate surveying skill to scan the ground ahead. The ability allowed him to examine nearly 16 feet deeper into the earth beyond the tunnel's current position. Then he finally found it: black coal. Excitement burst from Lloyd as he shouted that they were almost there and urged everyone to push forward just a little longer. The workers erupted in cheers. Lloyd even thanked Bangul directly, happily acknowledging that her abilities had sped up the excavation process nearly tenfold. Then he immediately began issuing the next set of instructions. Once they reached the coal layer, the shield would be dismantled and the mining space expanded. However, he repeatedly warned everyone not to lower their guard because the site was still extremely dangerous. At that exact moment, a faint sound echoed from somewhere within the coal seam. Lloyd abruptly turned toward the source. It sounded like falling rocks. Then another noise followed. This one was louder. Instinctively, Lloyd activated his surveying skill again. The moment he analyzed the surrounding terrain, shock exploded across his face. A cave had suddenly formed roughly 10 feet away. It had not existed moments earlier. Realization struck him instantly. Something was burrowing directly toward them, and it was moving incredibly fast. Suddenly, the tunnel wall burst open. A gigantic ant thrust its head through the opening. Shock overwhelmed Lloyd completely. He stumbled backward and fell onto the ground as the enormous insect lunged toward him, its giant mandibles snapping shut inches from his face. Then silver light flashed overhead. Javier's sword descended in a blur. With several swift strikes, the giant mandibles were sliced clean off. Lloyd instantly reacted. Grabbing his shovel, he sprang to his feet and smashed the ant's head downward with brutal force, hammering it into the ground like a nail. Breathing heavily, Lloyd struggled to steady himself. Deep within, panic lingered because this event had never appeared anywhere in the original story. Then another horrifying realization struck him. Ants never lived alone. His expression stiffened as dozens more giant ants appeared ahead of them. According to the original setting, giant ants were supposed to inhabit the eastern wilderness beyond the mountain range. They should never have been underground here. But reality no longer cared about what made sense. The ants poured out from the coal tunnel and charged straight at the workers. Terrified screams instantly erupted as the laborers scattered in panic and fled for their lives. Once again, silver light flashed through the darkness. Javier's sword carved through the air with terrifying speed. An ant's head split vertically down the middle before crashing lifelessly onto the ground. Deep within, Lloyd's thoughts spiraled violently as he stared at the endless swarm of giant ants pouring through the tunnels. He could not even estimate their numbers anymore. There could have been hundreds of them, maybe thousands. If those creatures ever escaped the mine and reached the surface, the entire Frontera Baroni would be destroyed. Even Javier could not possibly hold them back forever. The oxygen underground was already running dangerously low, and without dynamite, there was no reliable way to collapse the shaft. Even if the tunnel somehow caved in, the ants would simply dig themselves back out sooner or later. Lloyd's mind raced desperately from one possibility to another, trying to force out a solution before everything collapsed around them. Then suddenly, Javier struck Lloyd across the face and shouted at him to regain control before panic consumed him completely. Fury immediately flared across Lloyd's expression as he snapped back that he was not panicking at all. He was thinking of a plan. Javier slashed through another charging ant before shouting that Lloyd needed to think faster because he could not continue holding them off for much longer. And Javier was right. No matter how powerful he was, he still had limits. As Lloyd's thoughts spun wildly, several words suddenly connected together inside his head. In that instant, realization struck him like lightning. This could work. Lloyd immediately shouted for Javier to push forward because they were heading directly into the ant nest itself. Javier briefly glanced back at him with an expression that practically screamed disbelief. Lloyd's idea sounded completely insane, especially while Javier was already fighting for their lives. Still, Javier continued cutting through the ants without hesitation. His sword flashed with terrifying speed, carving silver arcs through the darkness so violently that it almost looked like a storm was erupting from his blade itself. Ants were sliced apart one after another as Javier forced a path forward. Without slowing down, he charged deeper into the nest while Lloyd sprinted after him, carrying a torch in one hand and a steel shovel in the other. Meanwhile, far above ground, the Baron had been peacefully enjoying the afternoon sunlight before a guard suddenly rushed toward him in panic. The moment he heard the report about wild ants appearing inside the mine, shock overtook him completely. His expression worsened further after learning that Lloyd had evacuated all the workers but chosen to remain underground with Javier while Sir Byron prepared to seal the mine. Without wasting even a second, the Baron rushed toward the armory. He quickly equipped his armor and immediately ordered everyone to move out. Back inside the tunnels, the battle continued growing fiercer. As he fought, Javier shouted over the chaos, demanding to know how much farther they still needed to go. Lloyd barked back for him to stop talking because he was busy searching. Inside his mind, however, Lloyd was becoming increasingly desperate. The only fortunate thing was that the ants still were not leaving the underground tunnels. Unfortunately, they were completely surrounding the two of them now, and Javier's stamina was rapidly approaching its limit. The scorching heat and suffocating lack of oxygen inside the cave were becoming unbearable even for him. Lloyd knew there was no more time left to waste. There had to be a methane gas layer somewhere beneath the nest. Frantically activating his surveying skill again and again, Lloyd scanned every inch of the surrounding terrain while running behind Javier. This entire region was filled with bituminous coal deposits, which meant methane gas had to exist nearby. If he could ignite it properly, he might be able to blow up the entire colony at once. Driven by desperation, Lloyd reduced the scanning range of his skill to maximize precision and searched through the underground layers as quickly as possible. Then finally, after endless frantic scanning, he caught sight of something beneath the surface. Methane gas. Relief flashed across his face the moment he found the hidden pocket underground. Without slowing down, Javier continued swinging his sword to keep the ants away, while Lloyd raised his torch, gripped his shovel tightly, and immediately began digging toward the methane layer. Then suddenly, a horrifying screech echoed from deep within the passageway. The entire cave trembled violently as something massive approached. A moment later, the creature finally revealed itself. It was the Queen Ant. Her gigantic body filled the tunnel with overwhelming pressure, but Lloyd barely cared about her appearance at all. This was not some battle arena game where defeating the boss automatically solved everything. Killing the queen was meaningless if the colony itself survived. Lloyd asked Javier whether he could hold her back. Javier answered honestly that he could not. Lloyd immediately snapped back, asking why Javier had already decided that without even trying first. Still holding his sword firmly, Javier calmly pointed out that some things could be understood without needing to test them. Even so, he admitted they had no other choice left at this point. The Queen Ant shrieked furiously and charged straight toward him, yet Javier never retreated even a single step. As he inhaled deeply, the surrounding mana began fluttering violently around his body. The energy condensed together and formed a triple circle. Then the clash began. Javier's longsword collided directly against the gigantic mandibles of the Queen Ant, sending deafening metallic shockwaves throughout the cave. Again and again, sword and mandibles crashed against each other. Neither side gave ground. The Queen Ant twitched her antenna while Javier narrowed his eyes with complete focus. The two monsters possessed nearly equal levels of devastating strength, and every collision shook the tunnel around them. Watching the battle unfold, Lloyd realized this was his only opportunity. Javier was somehow holding her back for now. That meant he had to finish quickly. Driven by desperation, Lloyd shoveled faster and faster. Sweat poured down his body as panic clawed at his chest. If Javier collapsed here, everything would end. Without him, the plan would fail completely, and the giant ants would eventually reach the surface. Then finally, a stream of methane gas burst out from the hole Lloyd had dug. The moment he saw it, Lloyd immediately grabbed his shovel and shouted for Javier to run toward the exit. Javier responded instantly. With one overwhelming slash, he forced the Queen Ant backward before dashing toward Lloyd's side. Together, the two of them sprinted through the opposite passageway, while the enraged Queen Ant chased after them at terrifying speed. As they ran, Lloyd suddenly turned around and locked eyes with the monster behind them. Without hesitation, he hurled the torch directly at the Queen Ant's face. The torch smacked against her head and bounced away, tumbling through the air behind her body before touching the invisible methane gas spreading throughout the tunnel. The instant flame met gas, the entire passageway erupted into a catastrophic chain reaction. At that exact moment, Javier lunged toward Lloyd and shielded him completely with his own body. Then the world exploded. A monstrous blast consumed the entire tunnel. Far outside the mine, Baron Frontera and the soldiers heard the deafening explosion echo through the mountain. Moments later, the entrance collapsed completely and became buried beneath rubble. Horror overtook the Baron instantly. He rushed toward the blocked entrance, screaming Lloyd's name, but Sir Byron quickly restrained him, desperately warning that he could not recklessly throw himself into danger as well. Deep inside the collapsed tunnel, Lloyd slowly regained faint awareness. His eyelids twitched irritatingly, but his body refused to move properly. He wanted to lift a hand to rub his eyes or shake his head clear, yet even those simple actions felt impossibly difficult. As Lloyd slowly regained his senses, his eyes drifted toward the Ant Queen lying motionless nearby. The enormous creature had been completely destroyed by the explosion, and relief quietly spread through him as he realized his plan had actually succeeded. Then his gaze shifted toward Javier. The knight lay unconscious on the ground after shielding Lloyd from the full force of the blast. Even Bangul was covered in injuries, her small body bruised and battered from the explosion. A wave of guilt struck Lloyd as he apologized softly to her, blaming himself for what had happened. Then he looked upward. The exit had collapsed. The sight instantly darkened his expression. The situation was far worse than he hoped. If this side of the tunnel had collapsed too, then they were completely trapped underground. Supporting himself with his shovel, Lloyd forced his aching body back onto his feet. At that exact moment, the system warned him that the oxygen level was continuing to drop. Lloyd desperately searched for a solution, but no matter how much he thought about it, reality remained unchanged. This was a life or death situation. There was nowhere left to run. The only option remaining was to dig through the collapsed tunnel, but the blockage stretched more than 15 feet deep. Even so, Lloyd refused to give up. Looking at Javier and Bangul, determination elation filled his heart as he swore that all three of them would escape together somehow. As the one who brought them here, he believed their lives were his responsibility. Suddenly, the system notified him that Javier had been moved by Lloyd's refusal to abandon them. His approval rating increased by 6 points. At the same time, the oxygen level dropped even lower. Lloyd clenched his teeth. There was no longer any room for hesitation. If this was his only chance, then he would gamble everything on it. Immediately, he called out to the system and demanded a skill upgrade search. Just as he wished, a new message appeared before him. The system displayed several compatible abilities: absorbing mana from the surroundings, processing absorbed mana, and amplifying absorbed mana. Those skills could now be combined into a single technique, the Azrahan Core Technique. Excitement immediately flashed across Lloyd's exhausted face. Ever since the duel against Neumann, he had continued practicing every chance he got. Now, anything he had already learned could be developed even further through the system. The RP cost required for the skill development was only 15 points. Without hesitation, Lloyd invested the points immediately. The result exceeded his expectations completely. Not only had he successfully acquired the Azrahan Core Technique, but the skill had started at level 5 instead of level 1. Lloyd instantly realized it was because of all the training and real combat experience he had accumulated, especially during the duel against Neumann. As the technique settled into his body, Lloyd could clearly feel the mana circles forming within him. He still lacked a proper mana heart, but the sensation of mana itself had become unmistakably real. Within his mind, excitement surged once again. Normally, improving a skill required endless effort and painfully slow progress, but Lloyd possessed RP. With enough points, he could raise skills to absurd levels almost instantly. That realization erased all hesitation from his mind. Lloyd immediately began pouring even more RP into the Azrahan Core Technique. As the levels rose, he noticed that each upgrade consumed 5 additional RP. A brief worry crossed his mind as he wondered whether the required points would eventually start increasing exponentially. But there was no point worrying about that now. He had no other choice left. If they wanted to survive, he needed to push this technique as far as possible. The level of Lloyd's Azrahan Core Technique skyrocketed relentlessly. The skill surged upward from level 6 to 7, then 8, 9, and finally 10, consuming nearly every remaining point of RP he possessed. At last, the message he had been desperately waiting for appeared before his eyes. The skill class had leveled up. The Azrahan Core Technique had evolved into a double circle technique at level 1, while his mana amplification rose to 200%. However, the next level now required 100 RP, and Lloyd only had 7 points left. Even so, Lloyd knew the system was not finished yet. He immediately demanded the additional rewards that usually appeared whenever his surveying and design skills advanced. As expected, 2 optional skills appeared before him. The first was Energizer, a skill that allowed him to move for 10 minutes without experiencing fatigue. The second was Latent Power Surge, a temporary enhancement capable of tripling his mana amplification for 20 seconds. Lloyd tightened his grip around the shovel handle until his knuckles turned white. Then he activated the first skill. At that moment, overwhelming strength flooded through his exhausted body like an explosion. His shovel tore through the rubble with a sonic boom as Lloyd began digging with monstrous force. Gravel and broken stone flew everywhere while he smashed through the collapsed tunnel like a machine possessed. Within his mind, only one desperate thought remained. Just a little more. Even the tiniest hole would be enough. Driven by pure survival instinct, Lloyd continued digging far beyond human limits. Every swing of the shovel carved away massive chunks of earth and stone. The tunnel shook violently under the relentless barrage as the oxygen level continued falling lower and lower. Then suddenly he saw it. The surveying skill revealed the intact tunnel ahead. It was still standing, only 14 feet away. Excitement exploded inside him and Lloyd pushed himself even harder. But at that exact moment, his knees suddenly collapsed beneath him. The system notified him that Energizer had reached its limit. The 10 minutes were over. Instantly, every ounce of strength vanished from his body. Exhaustion crashed into him like a tidal wave. His muscles screamed in agony as overwhelming fatigue swallowed him whole. Still, the exit was so close, only a little farther. Even as drowsiness from oxygen deprivation clouded his mind, Lloyd suddenly remembered the second skill. The moment he activated it, mana erupted violently through his body. Like a wild beast clawing its way free from a trap, Lloyd attacked the rubble with everything he had left. left. He stabbed, scraped, scooped, and tore through the dirt in complete desperation, while forcing his body closer and closer toward the intact tunnel. 6 feet remained, then 4, then 3, 2. Every movement became a battle for survival itself. At last, only a single foot-wide wall of dirt remained between him and freedom, and then the 20-second limit ended, and the oxygen level hit 0. The strength vanished from Lloyd's body instantly. The shovel slipped from his hands. His knees buckled helplessly beneath him. No matter how hard he tried, his eyes refused to stay open anymore. As consciousness slowly faded away, a bitter thought surfaced deep within him. All he had wanted was to live peacefully as the spoiled son of a countryside aristocrat, enjoying a sweet and comfortable life. Then the darkness began swallowing him whole. Somewhere in that fading haze, Lloyd suddenly heard a familiar voice. Podong. At first he thought it was only a hallucination, but something felt strange. The sound was far too clear. Using the very last shred of strength left inside him, Lloyd slowly lifted his head. Then a tiny hole suddenly appeared directly in front of him. A small hamster poked its head through the opening and happily called out once more. Utter disbelief spread across Lloyd's exhausted face. Then, for the first time since the collapse, fresh air finally rushed toward him, and Lloyd desperately gasped for breath. Forcing himself back onto his feet, Lloyd muttered to himself that he still had to survive because the sweet life of a nobleman's son was waiting for him. Then, despite his utterly exhausted body, he lifted Javier onto his back and slowly began marching toward the exit. At the same time, Baron Frontera and his soldiers were making their way deeper into the damaged tunnel while searching desperately for Lloyd. Baron warned the Baron that going any farther was far too dangerous, but the Baron refused to turn back. He ordered the others to retreat if they wished, declaring that he alone would continue searching until the very end. Then suddenly the Baron stopped walking. Far in the distance, someone was approaching through the darkness. It was Lloyd. Step after step, Lloyd continued moving forward without stopping, even while carrying Javier across his back. At that exact moment, the system notified him that he had surpassed his physical limits through improvisation and sheer determination. The experience was strongly affecting the growth of his Azrahan core technique. Before Lloyd could even process the message, one of the soldiers shouted after spotting him. Dozens of footsteps immediately thundered through the tunnel as everyone rushed toward him. The Baron was the first to reach him. Grabbing Lloyd's face with trembling hands, the Baron desperately asked whether he was hurt anywhere. But the moment Lloyd saw his father standing there, the final thread holding his exhausted body together finally snapped. Completely overwhelmed by fatigue, Lloyd collapsed directly into the Baron's embrace. At long last, the terrible ordeal was over. As the days passed, a rumor slowly spread throughout the entire Frontera territory. The story centered around Lloyd. According to the witnesses, the once brutish young master had evacuated all the workers the moment the giant ants appeared. Then, instead of escaping himself, he remained behind with Javier to protect everyone else. The rumors only grew more unbelievable after that. Lloyd had apparently charged directly into the ant nest itself and risked his life to save Javier as well. The evacuated workers and soldiers personally confirmed the events after seeing Lloyd emerge from the tunnel carrying Javier on his back. Before long, the entire fiefdom was talking about him. People spoke of how the young master had risked his life for the people of the territory and refused to abandon his loyal knight even in the face of death. Men raised their fists in admiration whenever his name came up. Women felt their hearts flutter hearing stories of Lloyd's bravery, while the elderly quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Meanwhile, Lloyd remained completely unconscious. No one expected him to sleep for so long. Finally, 4 days after being rescued from the tunnel, Lloyd slowly opened his eyes. The moment he awoke, the system greeted him with another notification. All the subjects of Baron Frontera had been deeply moved by his heroic courage and continued praising him endlessly. As a reward for this tremendous achievement, he had received a massive amount of bonus RP. Deep down, Lloyd honestly could not care less about being called a hero. But the moment he saw the reward amount, his eyes lit up immediately. 500 RP. Now that was sweet. In the original story, this was around the time the Frontera family lost everything. The Baron's family was supposed to be driven out of their estate while despair consumed both the Baron and Baroness. Lloyd himself was meant to spiral deeper into alcoholism until his life completely fell apart. But none of that was happening anymore. That cruel future was already being rewritten by Lloyd's own hands. And because of that, he became even more determined to keep changing what was to come. His loud voice echoed across the construction site as he ordered the workers to stop standing around lazily and get moving before the heat worsened. The workers immediately straightened up the moment they saw Lloyd approaching alongside Javier. Warm greetings instantly erupted from every direction. Some wished him a good day, while others sincerely thanked him once again for everything he had done. Caught completely off guard by the sudden respect, Lloyd awkwardly responded with an uncomfortable nod. Meanwhile, admiration burned brightly in the workers' eyes. Within their hearts, they truly believed Lloyd was different from ordinary nobles. To them, he was a man who had personally risked his life for the people beneath him. In their eyes, Lloyd had become the very image of noblesse oblige. Unfortunately for Lloyd, all the praise only made him increasingly uncomfortable. Deep down, he could barely handle it. 2 weeks had already passed since the wild ant incident, and during that time, the mining project had progressed smoothly without any major problems. Everything appeared stable on the surface. Still, Lloyd refused to lower his guard. Safety came first, especially after nearly dying underground. He intended to search every inch of the ant tunnels personally and eliminate even the smallest possible hazard before another disaster could occur. As they continued walking through the tunnels, Javier noticed Lloyd carefully inspecting the surroundings yet again and finally questioned why he insisted on performing such dangerous work himself. Javier pointed out that Lloyd was the heir to the territory and could easily leave the task to ordinary workers instead. But even as he spoke, another thought quietly surfaced within Javier's mind. Was Lloyd genuinely worried about the workers' safety? Lloyd immediately dismissed Javier's concern and declared that the greater the danger, the more important it was for the person in charge to stand at the very front. For a brief moment, Javier was genuinely stunned by those words. Then Lloyd turned around wearing his usual shameless grin and casually added that doing so also guaranteed nobody could complain when he claimed the largest share of the profits. The sudden shift left Javier completely speechless once again. Inside, confusion consumed him as he wondered whether Lloyd was actually a good person or an awful one. No matter how much time passed, Javier still could not figure him out. At that moment, the system quietly informed Lloyd that Javier's approval rating had almost increased. As they finally reached the very end of the tunnel, Javier remarked that there was nowhere left to search. But Lloyd suddenly stopped walking. Something felt strange to him. Staring at the wall ahead, he quietly noted that there seemed to be an empty space hidden behind it. Without hesitation, Lloyd grabbed his shovel and began digging into the wall. Watching him, Javier questioned whether it was really necessary to continue digging any farther. Lloyd immediately pointed out that the hidden area could easily be filled with ant eggs, and if those things hatched later, they would be dealing with another disaster all over again. However, the moment Lloyd finally carved open a path and peeked inside, he discovered something completely unexpected. A young orc warrior was hanging unconscious within the hidden chamber, tightly bound by sticky threads. Javier instantly stepped forward and declared that the creature looked dangerous enough to eliminate immediately. But Lloyd quickly stopped him and warned him not to act so recklessly. Then, after briefly studying the creature, Lloyd casually pointed out that it was obviously an orc, though he admitted something about the situation felt unusual. Javier examined the bound warrior and concluded that it was probably still alive. According to what he had heard, wild ants often paralyzed their prey and stored them away as food for later. The instant Lloyd heard that explanation, a deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. To him, this was not a problem at all. It was a jackpot. An incredible new item had practically fallen into his lap. Not long afterward, they brought the unconscious orc back to the mansion. Thanks to the Baron's physician, the young warrior recovered quickly. His name was Arash, the son of the Sand and Steel tribe's chief. After regaining consciousness, Arash sincerely thanked Lloyd for saving his life and vowed never to forget the kindness shown to him. Lloyd, however, became distracted by something completely different. He could not help questioning whether Arash intentionally kept adding oink to the end of every sentence just to make himself more memorable. Arash calmly denied understanding what Lloyd meant and proudly repeated that the son of the Sand and Steel tribe's chief never forgot acts of kindness. As repayment, he declared that Lloyd could ask for anything he desired. And that was exactly why Lloyd had rescued him. Sitting across from Arash, Lloyd immediately leaned forward with a sly grin and requested 120 orcs to work inside the mine. Arash instantly rejected the request without hesitation. Lloyd tilted his head innocently, acting completely confused by the refusal. Then his sly expression returned once again as he repeatedly questioned why such a request was impossible. Arash immediately pointed out that Lloyd had clicked his tongue earlier exactly like a villainous schemer. Lloyd shamelessly denied it and insisted it was merely a harmless habit, just like Arash constantly saying oink. Arash firmly explained that all orcs were warriors, and warriors only followed the commands of other warriors. Since Lloyd was not recognized as one, even if the tribe sent orcs to assist him, they would never obey his orders. Hearing that, Lloyd finally understood how the system worked among the orc tribes. Deep within, he quickly pieced everything together. He already knew that young orcs in the wilderness underwent a coming-of-age ceremony by hunting wild ants. Arash had probably ventured too deep into the nest during that trial and ended up paralyzed by the ants instead. And if that was the case, a sly idea suddenly formed inside Lloyd's head. He slowly smacked his lips together several times while thinking before suddenly clapping his hands with a cheerful smile. Acting completely casual, Lloyd congratulated Arash on successfully completing his coming-of-age ceremony. Arash immediately denied it. According to him, he had failed completely because he never managed to hunt a wild ant before getting paralyzed. Lloyd instantly pretended to look confused. Then he casually pointed out that the two of them had hunted one together. Arash blinked in confusion before finally following Lloyd's gaze toward the wall nearby. Mounted there was the severed head of the queen ant. Arash stared at it blankly and admitted he did not remember defeating anything that enormous. Without missing a beat, Lloyd immediately launched into the most shameless explanation imaginable. He sympathetically claimed that the paralysis must have damaged Arash's memory. According to Lloyd's completely fabricated story, the queen ant had already been trembling helplessly like a pile of rags by the time they arrived. He even claimed the ant had somehow spoken aloud and complained about being weakened by attacks from a young orc warrior. Arash looked completely bewildered and hesitantly questioned whether wild ants could even talk in the first place. Lloyd confidently insisted that they absolutely could. Then he smoothly continued the lie by explaining that thanks to Arash weakening the queen ant beforehand, Lloyd had easily finished it off afterward. Standing nearby, Javier silently watched the entire absurd performance with utter disbelief. Meanwhile, Lloyd continued skillfully guiding Arash toward the conclusion he wanted him to reach. The queen ant, according to Lloyd's version of events, had been defeated by both of them together. Naturally, every single word was a complete lie. Still wearing a sly grin, Lloyd dramatically referred to Arash as a great warrior before subtly including himself in the same category. Arash hesitated awkwardly for a moment before eventually agreeing and calling Lloyd a great warrior as well. The instant Lloyd heard that, he smoothly returned to the topic he actually cared about: the 120 warrior orcs. This time, determination blazed inside Arash's eyes as he proudly declared that Lloyd would have them. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.